The saga of OP's entitled mom and her golden child brother, who made her life a living hell until she had enough and cut ties with both of them. My childhood was meant for this sub. It shall be my home away from petty revenge. To start with some background, my mom was an Air Force brat, and her dad wiggled away from being arrested for something terrible that affects her to this day. This is not an excuse for what she did to us. She married a guy in the Navy and had my brother Donald, not my real name. He's just a lot like the character over a year after I was born. Childhood was a picture-perfect example of being raised by a narcissist, and that's a whole other load of baggage I have to deal with, but not here. You want to hear how she made us quit 2 separate jobs in the span of a month. You see, I was in community college and had no car, so I took the bus everywhere. It was not the best public transit system ever, but for $30, you could get a monthly pass that allowed you unlimited rides for the month, and after 4 days to and from school, it paid for itself in savings. Donald worked for a very popular grocery store, and he got his preferred task of retrieving carts from the parking lot. He loved it since he didn't really have to deal with customers, and the store was fine with having a guy who didn't mind harassing the bums who tried to take carts off the property, since retrieving each cart actually costs a fair bit. The trip to work from home took 45 minutes. Same for the return trip, and he worked part-time at minimum wage. I worked for the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association at their Southwest Fisheries branch, and due to its location, it usually brought on student hires from UC. I worked for the ichthyoplankton department, which includes larval fish, and it was my job to curate their historical fish collection, label, relabel, organize, and catalog their database, so the samples could be studied at length, since the data was used to track the health of the fish offshore. And the data was useful to the Fish and Game Department for what they could and couldn't do for the year to keep the fishing trade strong. I loved it, loved my boss, and ignored the UC hires who looked down on the community college girl. I took 45 minutes to get from school to work, worked 5 to 5.5 hours a day, and was paid $11 an hour, which was a bit above the minimum wage. The trip home was another 45 minutes. Somehow this reliable and paid work offended Mom, and she spent 3 months moaning and whining about it taking so long for us to get home and get to work. Wouldn't it be better to work closer to home? Blah blah blah. While that may be true for Donald, the location he was at was where he was hiring, and Noah only had one location in town. Anyone familiar with any bus system knows there are also delays, buses arriving late due to traffic, relief drivers being delayed due to traffic, and the like, so it sometimes took an hour to an hour and 12 minutes to get home. Donald and I planned accordingly for arriving at work on time, and we both always got to our shifts early and clocked in promptly. Every delay on the way home was met with accusations of listening to music too loud or playing our portable games and not paying attention, to the point that every time she asked why we were home late one day, we both answered, "The bus didn't show up on time, and no, not because of the Game Boy." This answer was met with a hurt expression and a rebuke for not being about to ask that. Finally, I'd had enough, and I recorded her whine one day about the long trips and played it for my boss, who knew about Mom from time in Girl Scouts, as both served in a local service unit organizing programs for younger girls. She believed me, and despite it not being normal for the department, they arranged for a party usually reserved when UC hires were done for their semester to see me off properly. It was lovely, and I missed them all very much. I loafed miserably in my room until my final paycheck was mailed. I had only worked there for 7 months. She asked me what made me decide to quit, as if she weren't solely responsible for it. "Because I was tired of you whining about how long it took to get to work." Donald loved his job, but spending 6 hours on pavement took its toll, and he often bought insoles to minimize the impact and strain caused by it. He was in fairly consistent, low-grade pain. A mere 2 weeks after I quit, he quit, and Mom couldn't be happier, preening about how good it would be not to have him angry at home because of the strain of the work, but wondering why he didn't request to transfer to the branch that was a 7-minute walk away from home instead. "Because I was tired of you banging about how long it took to get to and from work." Dad believed the both of us, and said he understood that Mom was being unreasonable. Edit. Mom hasn't worked a paid job since 1997, and routinely tried to sabotage my brother and me when we got work so we'd stay home. Then she'd whine we didn't have jobs. She recited the importance of showing up to work on time. But when we took her up on offers to drive us to work, she always left late, forcing us to be late. Edit 2. So, I was told this was read on YouTube. I'm stunned. Update. TLDR. Psycho mom steals from her own kids for over a decade. I can't decide if this goes here or entitled parents, But the entitled parents Reddit seems to hate tales told by the nice kid. So I'll give this sub a try. Let me knows if it belongs over there. But the heckling for not giving mom her just desserts was really harsh. Some backstory. My brother, whom we'll call Donald like the duck. They're practically the same, and I had some challenges. We both have ADHD. He has OCD, and I'm visually disabled. Our dad was in the military, so he was gone full time, and mom was a type of controlling, neat freak who could on rare occasions be a decent parent. But this story wouldn't exist if she was a good mother all the time now, would it? As a very young child, I had a security item. It wasn't a blanket or a certain item of clothing like a tutu. It was this lovely plush horse. When I couldn't take it out of the house with me, I had it on my pillow so I could curl up with it at night. As I'd had it for years and was only in the 2nd grade, it had seen some use, love, and the typical wear and tear you would expect. The little inserts in its hooves that let it stand had nearly all fallen out. Its coat wasn't quite as white as it once was, and the yarn that made up its mane and tail was fraying at the tips from the braiding and unbraiding I did. I was in the full pony phase, with paraphernalia from a popular franchise, and even blankets and sheets. As a kid with some challenges, my room was never spotless. I usually had some toys outside my bin, had some clothes laying about that I missed during cleanup, and usually let my favorite jacket lay on top of my bed as I used it every day. Normal things for kids that age, but to mom, I may as well have let my room degenerate into a trailer park horror story with wall-to-wall garbage with how strongly she reacted, and her solution to the problem was no less extreme. One day, as I was walking home from being dropped off by the school bus, I saw her putting brown paper bags into the trunk, which I thought was strange because groceries go into the house and not the other way around. And when I asked her about it, she told me to clean up my room before closing the trunk and driving off. Figuring it was just some socks and toys, I entered the house and saw what had bent her out of shape this time, and I stood at the door to my room in shock. It looked like a tornado had touched down. Each and every drawer from my dresser was completely removed. Their contents were dumped on my bed and floor, and some of the drawers were dropped on the other side of the bed. All my books, all my clothes, and all my toys were scattered, and the only presentable thing in my room was the bed, which was still made. My room definitely hadn't been this way when I'd left for school. Confused, I went to see if my brother had gotten home yet, and I knocked on his door before letting myself in. His room looked the same way, but with more Tonka trucks and Ninja Turtles instead of ponies and Barbies. When Donald got home, Mom still hadn't come back, and he flipped his SHT when he saw his room and went to mine to demand why I'd messed up his things, only to see me frantically trying to clean my room, while crying and telling him Mom wanted us to clean up the mess. At this young age, we both feared her because she was a slap-happy wench, and she had thoroughly convinced us that Dad worked too hard to deal with our laziness and general uncleanliness. So we both had a sense of urgency to get our rooms clean, if not before she came back home, then definitely before Dad got back from the naval base. When it came to punishments, I can't remember why we feared Dad's countdowns more than being bent over Mom's lap, but we never got down to one with him, and she hit us regularly no matter what we did. We both managed to clean up, with neither of us being wiser for what had actually happened until that night. I picked through my room looking for that plush horse, and I couldn't find it and couldn't recall seeing it when I was cleaning. So I did the sensible thing and asked my mom if she'd seen it and got a Karen response. "Oh, I donated that old thing. You didn't need it anymore." May I reiterate that, in 1st or 2nd grade, you are still young enough to have a security item, and my bee of a mother decided to get rid of it before I was ready. I went to Donald to ask if he noticed anything of his things missing, and he got back to me the next morning, saying yes, he was missing some things. I know what you're saying, normal parent things, but this is just the beginning. See, she did this just often enough that I learned the sounds of the mornings when she was most likely to tear our rooms a new hole, and I feared she'd take my piggy bank, so I got very good at emptying it with alarming quietness. It was a pig that a family member had made from a milk jug that I kept all my change in. I put all my coins into a cheap denim purse that I filled with socks to reduce the rattling, and put it in the bottom of my backpack before putting all my school things on top of it. This made my bag a lot heavier than it needed to be, and I got to be an unusually strong elementary school kid having to deal with it. It's a wonder I didn't stunt my growth or damage my spine. $7 worth of pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters isn't the lightest thing to haul. On one of these bad mornings, I pulled the plastic coat rack out of my closet wall, and I couldn't just stick it back up as I'd torn the drywall anchor free, so I had no choice but to leave it at the bottom of my closet and ask Dad to hang it back up. School proceeded as normal, And this time I got home to see the brown paper bags in the entry hall by the front door with my coat hanger on top of one of the bags. This was not going to happen. Not this time, I decided. So I reached into the bag to retrieve my property and went on to my room to greet Mom in the act of tearing Donald's room apart. When she saw that I had reclaimed what she intended to steal, she snatched it from me. "What do you think you're doing with that? It's garbage you left on the floor. Give it here." I was mostly honest and told her I'd accidentally torn it down when getting some of my costume jewelry that I had on a cheap plastic ring that hung from it along with my denim purse. I told her I was going to ask Dad to hang it back up, and she flipped her SHD, snapping the coat hanger in two and throwing the pieces at my head before saying I could keep those and good luck getting Dad to do anything with it. This wasn't chronologically the second time she'd donated or stolen from us, but it was the most memorable as I'd tried to reclaim something she'd identified wrongly as trash. By this time, she'd done a number on my dresser drawers, and I'd had to set them on top of Dad's wardrobe to fix them. All the while, Mom told him that I was careless with my furniture and didn't tell him the truth as to who'd done the wrecking of said drawer. I'd cried to my teachers by this point, anyone who would listen, but nothing ever happened. I was a minor, and I had to listen to my mom and do whatever she said, even if it was wrong and she was stealing from me. I made it my personal mission at this point to make her miserable and tried to get Child Protective Services involved because this bee needed to get lit, and I was not going to let her get off scot-free. And yes, even in the 3rd grade, I was starting to think of my mom as a bee because who else would treat their kids this way? The 3rd time I recall clearly was in the 4th grade. This time I caught her in the act of ripping my room apart, and I stood in my doorway at my full, insignificant height and glared all the daggers a kid my age could at this wicked witch who was taking my piggy bank, the one made for me by my uncle with Alzheimer's, as she was putting it in a brown paper bag. "What do you think you're doing? That's my bank, made for me by Uncle Jerry. You put that back right now." I'd made a good impression of her inflections and all, and she looked up in surprise, in part from being talked to like the W she was by her eldest kid, and likely because she was so busy ruining my room, she didn't notice I'd come home a bit early. This time Donald was home, and he was watching the exchange from his room. I could all but hear him vibrating with glee, seeing her being treated the way she treated others. But it was short-lived as she stuttered before storming out of my room to grab a pair of scissors and return. I got bounced off the door frame, got my glasses broken, and fell on my buttocks. What came next was unforgivable, even if you could say it was deserved given what I'd said to her. There were 3 long, ragged cuts. Coin slot to halfway down the right side, nose to the belly, and coin slot to tail. She even tried to cut the lid in half with the scissors, but she couldn't do that. So she took the body of the pig and torqued it before throwing the ruined gift at my head and storming out of my room with what she'd managed to pilfer. I tried using packaging tape to fix it, and I got to keep it for another month before she eventually threw it out. And the reason she was taking my piggy bank? I wasn't using it. I'd gotten so good at emptying out my bank that she legitimately thought it was just taking up space on top of my bookshelf. This continued throughout elementary school, but she got bored, or perhaps I'd provoked her to new levels of demented mothering. And she decided after the 5th grade that she'd thrown in some psychological elements by telling us as we went to school that she wanted us to go through our rooms to get her things she would donate. And if we didn't, she was going to get them from us the next day before we got home from school. Thanks, Mom. Being terrified of you to begin with every moment we were home. Being unable to escape you at school because the school district hired you to deal with us. And then having the emotional equivalent of a guillotine over our heads with that lovely threat really made our lives better. I don't know how long this lasted exactly because it became so regular. But in my junior year of high school during lunch, I had one of those weird, eye-opening moments of clarity where I realized it hadn't happened in a while. I wasn't about to ask her about it, but that day I read my old diary. I'd written in it every time she tore my room apart. But in late middle school, I'd stopped because, for a short while, I'd lost the key. I shared these tales with Dad this year, and I honestly thought he knew. They divorced last year, and I could see the shock, the pain, and the horror as he was told in detail what happened under his nose that Mom managed to hide, and that my brother and I were convinced to hide from him. I will never receive compensation for the damage done by her. Nor will I ever understand why she felt my brother and I deserved this treatment. She stole from us religiously every month in the name of cleaning, and as our parents, she got away with it because no one would stand up to her and help the kids she was subjecting to emotional and mental abuse. To this day, I have a bit of a hard time letting material things go, but I'm getting better. And yes, I called the CPS on her more than once, but they always wandered away, and nothing ever changed. Update. Narcissistic grandma alienates the family to the point of denying her husband a funeral. Okay, since my friend has encouraged me to share more entitled parent stories, this is my second story, but I've given permission to my friend to post it for me. English is my first language, but if I make mistakes, it happens. In any case, this isn't about my own parents, but rather one of my mother's, namely her mother, aka my maternal grandmother. To sum up, my mother is a very sweet, extroverted woman. If you had to pick at least one negative thing about her, it would be her hyperactivity. This is in part due to a medical condition, which I will not be naming to keep some sense of anomaly, which actually almost killed her when giving birth to me, as well as when she was as young as 6, and does cause her notable pain when it's active as her own body literally attacks her. This condition was inherited from both her parents, and while her father, my grandfather, handled it very well, despite the fact that back when my mother was young, it wasn't the best understood condition. She was an equally social individual who'd do anything to help. Her mother, my grandmother, did not. Some of the stories told by my mother about her own mother when she was young paint her as a narcissist, always trying to show a great image, but SHT talks behind people's backs. Honestly, I think she wanted the image of having kids, but didn't want to have the attention taken from her by the kids. A lot of the stories hinted at weird jealousy toward her own kids, especially when my grandpa gave my mother or her brother attention like a decent parent, or would actively encourage or promote actions in which my mother or brother could potentially be hurt. Which never worked, thankfully. But one thing out of all the stories my mother told me, especially when she got sick, and even when she was literally dying at an age, not even in the double digits, was that her mother was worse off. Now here's where I actually came into the picture while interacting with this woman. Admittedly, when I was younger, I kind of had an issue with male figures thanks to my own father, so I really fell for my grandmother's sweetness and didn't overly trust my grandfather. As I got older, though, I really started to see what the heck this woman was like. Some of the highlights I noticed in particular were the fact she would try to baby me much like a 5-year-old or younger in a somewhat aggressive way with comments like, "You didn't stay little," or little hints at her disdain for her ever-increasing age and messed up health. Keep in mind that this woman had the same health condition as my mother, who actively looked after herself and never let it stop her from being active, while grandmother smoked like a chimney, ate unhealthy, and never exercised, which ultimately made her gain weight and made her condition worse. Somehow she was the victim, and we had to feel sorry for her. Continuing on, I'd hear stories about how my grandparents helped their kids go to university, which was a lie confirmed by my uncle, my mother's brother, and grandfather. They sent a bit of money, not a lot, but nothing else after, and they worked their arses off to put themselves through school. The weird part, though, is that both my mother and brother were separated by a distance, and both were convinced that their parents helped put the other through the university until the lie was confirmed. Admittedly, this started to really get me wary, as I, at the time, 10 years ago, felt it was off, and after the confirmation of the lie, being the nosy and smart bastard, I later discovered it originated from my grandmother boasting to anyone she could tell, I guess, to make herself look better. If you look at my last post, you'll know that my mother had a very good job with money, not being a huge issue, and had also been very successful in her art, being very popular locally at local shows due to her social nature. She actually told me once that she had never once heard her grandmother praise her for anything. So me, being a little SHT, decided to test this when the grandparents called. I was talking with my grandmother and was talking about my mother's success and how talented she was, etc., with very blatant and opportune chances. Any normal parent or person could probably say something positive. This was the second event that really made me feel disgust for this woman. The third event actually came when we went to visit in person. I had just left my dad for maybe about a year now, and grandfather was very kind and supportive, while grandmother did her usual pour me crap. Between all the crap I went through with my dad and the bullying, somehow she was always worse off. Heck, at the time, I had been recently hung by necklaces around my neck on school hooks by bullies and even choked. I was and still am very small, and back then I was much smaller than most kids. As a result, I kind of developed discomfort with anything near my neck, especially people, which I warned everyone, even family, about, as I'd very likely lash out in response if I felt in danger. When we were about to leave, our grandparents wanted a hug. It was not very abnormal, but when I got to my grandmother, I warned her to be careful around my neck. She brings me into a hug, which was more like a headlock around my neck with her babying behavior. And with me getting anxious, I warned her to let go by the time I got to my second warning, which involved the promise I couldn't guarantee I wouldn't react physically. It took my mother and grandfather literally prying her off, and I needed to be comforted by my mother on the way out. Not much happened after that, and we never saw them again physically. There was always the same poor me and usual whenever they called, and they even missed my mother's and stepdad's wedding because grandmother made a point to ensure they couldn't go, forcing granddad to stay as she was very dependent on him since she never left their home unless it was for her. Granddad eventually developed dementia, and thus the two were forced to enter an elderly home, much to my grandmother's delight as attention was all for her. We actually ended up hearing about all the lies she was telling the workers at the home, painting me and my mother as ungrateful and abandoning them. In truth, though, we just didn't want to deal with her, and honestly couldn't really go see them because of our limited personal time and the cost of visiting, only to be exposed to her increased toxicity. Yeah, none of us wanted to deal. The funny thing is that she was telling the workers about all the expensive things she and granddad paid for us, including lessons and courses for fun sports activities. A lie I thought was funny as hell was that one course for said activity was actually initially paid for by my dad when I was still living with him, not my grandparents. It actually got so bad that workers actually called both my mom and uncle for the truth, even though they, by their own admission, knew it was all lies. Apparently, according to some of the information and stories I got from family, the workers despised her when they had to tend to her. But the final nail in the coffin actually came and resulted in the absolute alienation of the grandmother, and no contact came after granddad passed. Granddad was a kind man who would help everyone and honestly was in love with grandmother, even if she wasn't the greatest person, and stayed with her till the end of his days. But he was easily manipulated by her. As a result, no money was put towards a funeral, and thanks to my grandmother, no one wanted to come to any funeral simply because she would be there. I think the worst aspect, though, was that we had to find out of granddad's passing through uncle, who only found out in the most roundabout way via old friends of granddad who checked in on him. Again, granddad had dementia, so he wasn't all there, and grandmother, in order to keep up her image of the poor, made sure not to include contact information for any family. So in the end, she took her entitled narcissist behaviors to the point of alienating her own kids and all remaining family to not leap in to attend or make a funeral for a great man of the family happen. And she denied him that right, even despite having the money to have one, just so she could have it for herself. We heard a bit from the workers at the home, here and there, after we got the number to the home of her actions and granddad's death. We were all disgusted. From what we heard, granddad was cremated, and his ashes were spread along walks he frequented. We, however, cut ties with his grandmother entirely and planted a tree in his memory at the location in which he lived on our property. Rest in peace, granddad. Update. My entitled mom tries her own thing and resents not being allowed to do so. TLDR, as requested, the entitled mom thinks she knows best and does her best Dialga impression to control her husband and kids' free time. For as long as I can remember, mom has always been the first and final word in everything. And if you started poking holes in her logic, using logic from that morning or the previous day, you were punished. And this included house rules. I suppose some of the extremes she went to try and discipline us were related to the fact that my brother Donald, who's just like Donald Duck, annoying, useless, but occasionally awesome, and I were smarter than average and found workarounds by obeying the letter of the rules, but not their spirit because they were so arbitrary and served only to give her opportunities to steal from and beat us from elementary school onward. We were going to get punished anyway, so what did it matter if we cheated a little? It was the time of dialing up the internet and getting browsers in the mail as CDs, and we got our first computer, which gave her some leverage since we wanted to play games on it. But she didn't want our schooling to suffer, so she justifiably placed a time limit on non-school related activities on its use. Entirely reasonable, right? Well, we had to earn our time on the computer by doing chores instead of an allowance, which she seemed violently allergic to. What she never told us until it happened was that at any time she chose, we'd get our time taken away permanently, but we both found the sweet spot of her forgetfulness and reclaimed every last sweaty, hard 1 second we were owed. Time goes on, and we get a PlayStation 1, and the play limit extends there as well. But given that it's my brother's system, there's now a twist. We each have our time, but I had to ask his permission to play, which he never gave because he was the golden child and the apple of mom's eye. I had to go to dad to work around this since Donald blew his daily allowed game time as soon as he got home from school, and I waited till after homework for mine. Mom didn't like this and tried to enforce the rule of asking Donald, to which dad had my back, and there was a screaming match in base housing over why their daughter had to ask permission from her younger brother to play a console that mom kept in the living room anyway, because she didn't trust anyone not to sneak around her and play. It was glorious. They fought a lot about things like that. But she always won since, at the time, my dad was on active duty and she was always home. We coped with this inescapable torment in different ways, with Donald becoming her yes-man and brown-noser for preferential treatment, and I sided with Dad because, even at that young age, I knew this SHT was whack, and I wasn't going to stand for it. It went on like this until college, and she's carried on like she owned the time associated with any electronic device, and even forbade us from getting cell phones. She said because we weren't responsible enough. But it was about phone games. She couldn't reasonably keep us from playing outside the house on them, and therefore couldn't deny us gaming time on one. Mom even went so far as to try to keep us from leaving the house on the weekends. We were being punished just so we couldn't see our friends and potentially play games at their houses. She should honestly have tried a different punishment, because she was living proof of insanity at that point, expecting us to stop taking advantage of her forgetfulness to get our time back. She hated it whenever I got Dad involved to enforce the rules on Donald, who was as entitled as Mom and was slightly immune to her attempts to limit game time. The screaming matches between our parents over her entitled hypocrisy led to cops being called and counseling being recommended, which, to Mom's credit, we did as a family. Little changed, except that the therapist told Mom she was being unreasonable and was going to stress herself to an early grave if she didn't ease up. Why didn't she try establishing a structured list of rules for the family anyway? Everyone in the family says you change everything at the drop of a hat when mad. So if the rules are written and followed, then there'd be less complaining and fighting, right? A month later, we have the result, and honestly, it looked more like what parents set up for their second graders than a serious thing for a college student. Rules, concrete rules. Rules she could only change if we all agreed to the change, or most of the family anyway, with ironclad rewards and punishments. Donald and I grilled her for hours on the new rules, making sure we understood every line, and that she understood that her BS about arbitrarily denying us time on any computer or console game was not a part of these rules and would not be tolerated. She kept whining about us making the introduction of the rules longer than it had to be, but she was slipperier than a sea slug, and we all wanted to know the ins and outs of this new way of living and its implications. The short of it was that there was a daily list of chores that had to be done, and missing something meant you had to draw from a colored stack of index cards for your punishment, which had a wild card to be any other card in the pile and a free card, because sometimes you got away with SHT. Rewards were given for days without punishment, with bonus rewards at the end of a perfect week. The rewards were poker tokens that could be saved and cashed in for a set list of established rewards like an extra soda, extra time on a computer, etc. But if you could argue the case, they could have a $1 value towards something from a store. The plan was ultimately to have this phased out, as we were all too old to do this for any extended period of time, and some things were changed, such as the soda reward being removed after Donald used his saved tokens to buy a 12-pack of soda that he kept in his room so he wouldn't have to share. That rule was removed, and the one about bonus game time was nearly removed as well. But I pointed out that I rarely used that one or the soda reward, and Mom hadn't gotten any family consensus to remove the soda perk. It was only her and Dad. I refused to let another perk get the axe because she didn't like what Donald did and wasn't willing to keep him from abusing the system and punishing the rest of us because of his entitlement. She didn't like this at all and tried to undermine this new system by trying to use wildcards to take away our playtime, which was against the rules, and she was not allowed to get away with that. Dad and I saw her chomping at the bit here, and we knew this blessed system was living on borrowed time. This marked the beginning of her killing a system that everyone but her loved because of its structure, predictability, and clean-cut rewards and punishments. It protected us from her, and we'd all signed the faux contract that stated we would follow and obey until a set date and time. It was slow at first, forgetting to give us our reward tokens, which Dad was happy to dole out. She'd try to misplace the slips of paper we had our token counts on, because we were racking up quite a few at that point, only to find that Dad had a ledger of who had what since he too had a stack of reward coins, and he knew what that moist bint was up to. I had to get a ledger in which I hid a torn stuffy, because I'd be damned if she didn't try to find and get rid of anything used to track our accumulated rewards. Around this time, our internet provider announced a deal. If we got a brand new Wi-Fi router, we could get a deal on it, and a month of accelerated bandwidth for half the cost or upgrade to the next best router, which required LAN cables. Dad, Donald, and I were all excited at the thought of the wireless router, as Mom had taken to turning off the internet in individual rooms after throwing a fit to have the router placed in the hot as balls garage over her car. Not a good place for a router, but perfect for a vindictive, unemployed housewife on a power trip. Needless to say, we didn't get a Wi-Fi router, And her behavior just got worse towards the rule set that kept her in check before. Her antics by unplugging LAN cables meant our schooling suffered as courses were migrating to incorporate online classwork. The therapist had given us a time frame to observe this rule set before phasing it out. And we weren't even a quarter of the way through it when Mom flipped her entitled SHT one day and went storming down the hall to where I was perched on a chair in front of Donald's PS3 loading some games. And she burst in like a bat out of hell, red in the face and steaming with a brown smear on her ankle. "Abraxas, you didn't pick up all the dog SHT yesterday before you mowed the lawn. And I got it all over my foot. You lost your game time. That's against the rules. Gotta make me draw a card, Mom. Fine, have it your way." She stormed down the hall in all her waddling and limping glory and slammed my set of punishment cards down on the kitchen counter with a look of unfiltered joy on her face. We had all been marking our cards for months with various stains of sauces when cooking, so we knew what we were in for. And my top card was free, so I pulled it and showed it to her. "Free. Well, that's not fair. Draw another." "Sorry, Mom, but failing to pick up doggy dollops only requires one draw. And you knew there's a chance to draw the free card out of all 32 of them." "I don't have to draw, and it's against the rules." Mom turned a lovely shade of purple as I turned away and had my hour of playtime. This was the final nail in the coffin of that rule set. And Mom took all the reward tokens from everyone and threw them in the trash in front of Dad, who confronted her, as it was against what the therapist had said and wasn't done with general consent. A shouting match ensued, and it ended with Dad pulling all the punishment cards and throwing them out with the tokens and dumping wet coffee grounds on the whole mess to ruin her precious index cards. Dad said that if she had solely decided to break the rules and disregarded the therapist's warnings about this kind of thing to stop having to reward good behavior, he was going to ruin the punishments, so she couldn't arbitrarily punish people with a broken system. She eventually started screaming that she was going to call the cops and tried to drag Donald and me around the house with her as a human shield, despite Dad having never been physically violent to her. She screeched to be left alone, or she'd call the cops. It was like she thought we'd be okay with returning to the way things were before, only with a lot more unpaid chores and requirements for us. She just couldn't let go of her own ego long enough to let the therapist-approved system work and undo the damage she'd caused for over 25 years. And she refused to admit she did anything wrong. I still remember, to this day, the dumbfounded look on her face when Dad dumped the coffee on the pink, green, and white cards that she adored. To be honest, the system would have worked better for elementary kids, but she was too busy being an entitled control freak to let such a thought enter her thick head to entertain that maybe certified child therapists knew what they were saying at that time, and she was messing us up from a young age with her BS. Nor did it cross her mind that it would take a lot more than 7 months to undo the damage that had been ongoing since then, along with all the other trauma from the abuses she delivered to us all daily. Update. Delusional and entitled stepsister gets cut off from family when Daddy won't bend backwards for her anymore. I have gotten feedback wanting a follow-up with my control freak mom, but that's not what this tale is. It's another tale from my friend, who shared about his grandma, and has given me permission to share a fresh tale of woe about their family. A little grammar, spelling, and whatnot were corrected, but all content is as presented. Update. I put this in the wrong sub, and it was taken down. My bad. I hope you still like it. Alright, I'm back with another story that I'm letting my friend post for me. And this time we're going to take a step away from my direct blood relatives and focus on my step family. For the record, I know this one might seem fake. Heck, to this day, I have no clue how someone was so entitled and delusional about the world to be alive this long. There is so much SHT that this person has done it all kind of blur together. And it's been a few years now since they've made an appearance, much less made contact with my family. Disclaimer. English is my first language. I also omitted some information to keep it anonymous. If you haven't read my previous posts, I've let my friend post for me. To put the long story short, I'm an only child who eventually chose to live with only my mother. We eventually moved to a different town, and that's where she met her amazing current husband and my stepfather. Despite me not being his kid, he has been more of a father to me than my own. Now I won't go into too many details, but my stepdad had 5 kids before marrying my mother, and the majority of them have some form of entitlement or were married into entitlement. We're going to focus on the youngest of the 5, my sister. And in case you're all wondering, I'm the second youngest, with steps only being about a year younger. When things were just starting between stepdad and stepmom relationship-wise, stepsis had gotten knocked up in her late teens by what I would describe as the very stereotypical tradesman that you hear some folk describe when they talk negatively about trades. Always dirty, smokes like a chimney, drinks like a fish, seems to have a constant deer in the headlights, etc. Stepdad had opted to help the two get on their feet and let them live in his home rent-free, and the only condition was that they pay for any extra food they wanted. This was to ensure that when the baby was born, they'd have money saved up to, buy their own place or find a good place to rent and pay said rent like responsible adults. Which actually would have been very much possible, as the father actually worked despite everything, a very lucrative job. Well, if you guessed they didn't do that, you'd be very much right. Not only did they buy crap they honestly didn't need, but they also filled Stepdad's fridge with loads of garbage food that they ultimately never consumed and left to rot. They regularly disrespected him, treating him more like a piggy bank to get money from when they spent their own money irresponsibly. And they left their living space, which was the entire basement, an ungodly pigsty. Eventually enough was enough, and after much pushing, they were forced to find a different place to live by Stepdad, who at this point in the relationship with my mom wanted me and Mom to move in at his place, and even helped fix up and sell our house. Now I had only heard stories from my stepbrother about his siblings, including his stepsister. Some highlights include walking around at night in shady places like back alleys, with a delusional idea that nothing bad could happen to her. To some of her other begging to my stepdad, very expensive and fancy items that something cheaper would do an equal job at. So I honestly just thought there was no way someone was that out of touch with reality. I had been born and lived in a city most of my life, and I knew you never did any of the SHD that she's done if you wanted to keep your money and your current blood content. That was when I met them in person, and apparently they had decided not to leave Dad's place after we sold our house and were preparing to move in with Stepdad. Looking back, I think this was an effort to screw over me and my mom just as much as it was her effort to guilt my stepdad to let her stay, as she used her unborn child at the time as an excuse to try and guilt him to let them stay. Thankfully, Stepdad put his foot down, as he didn't have anything against the kid, but would not raise them for stepsister. A bunch of drama happened here and there after, with little things such as more begging for money and, heck, even some choosing beggar moments when things were offered. The big one I remember was being offered a used vehicle that still ran just fine, only to demand the new vehicle my stepdad just got. I did see stepsis every so often during family gatherings. They'd talk about expensive road trip plans, then act like at the same time they'd pay for schooling to be cooks and elaborate mental gymnastics on how she's going to go to Europe for this education. Keep in mind, too, that she's still pregnant. I'm sorry there's not more I can describe here. It was so long ago, and honestly, this was so much the norm that it all blurred together. However, this one I do remember very well, and is the reason no contact eventually happened. Stepsister, at this point, had her kid. Mom and stepdad had gotten engaged. My mom at the time was very much beloved by most of stepdad's family, except, you guessed it, stepsister. At this point, her constant denial of any aid from her stepfather had left her pretty bitter toward me and Mom, she and her mom's stepdad's ex, the very clear source of entitlement. But that's a different story. Actually tried to spread horrid rumors among the town about me and Mom. I guess we are hoping to turn the town and family against us. The joke is on them, though this backfired horribly, and anyone with a brain or balls to actually interact with us knew we were decent folk. If anything, it made them look worse as they tried to play me off as some mentally disturbed moron. They used other things I won't mention, and my mom as this harpy who got her claws into stepdad. Ultimately, it culminated with stepsis declaring to stepdad that she will never accept me or my mom as family, and things along the lines of stepdad losing a daughter and his grandson, and that she should not marry my mom. Stepdad is choosing them over her and her son. Despite the talks between stepdad and her, things fell apart, with stepdad even blatantly pointing out all the help he had tried giving her. She was uninvited to the wedding, practically disowned due to the sheer level of her actions, which words can do no justice to, and moved out of town to the nearby city. From what I hear, she hasn't really grown up, but still parties like a teen and pawns off her kid to her mother for babysitting, and whoever else she can. And she regularly uses her kid more as some form of leverage for something, even if it's not coming from my stepfather. I honestly fear that kid will grow up as bad as his own mom is entitled. But he's also being raised by an entitled grandmother, which is another story. As for stepdad and mom, they are still very happily married. Update. Many have said in my other stories about my family that I should have cut contact and moved out. I hope the wait for the tale of how I did is appealing to you all. If you're not familiar with the tales of my family, I'll add links to them here. TLDR. I watched my brother's and his boyfriend's failure to move out as a springboard for my own exodus from my entitled mother. Let's dive into our cast, and then the story. Donald, my entitled brother. Mom, entitled mother. Dad, a cool, and now retired military man. Andy, a good-for-nothing parasite in human skin. Bubbles, my amazing girlfriend. Me, just me. When Andy first came to our house, he tried to settle in and worm his way into all aspects of our lives, which an entitled person is likely to do. But he met resistance when he ran into Mom. There was no room in our family for a second parasite or entitled person. He tried to get close to her and Dad, but Game recognized him, and Mom openly discouraged him from being around. Dad had long since grown thick skin and developed a lack of tolerance for certain behaviors after being married to Mom for nearly 25 years. So Andy turned his attention to me. And while I did like having someone to talk about anime with, I wasn't going to let him sink his meat hooks into me. Not after a lifetime of mistreatment from Mom. He was done trying to convert me to the Andy is always right club when he was trying to convince Dad to get a third PlayStation controller so we could play group games. The conversation went a little like this, and isn't as exact as it was about 10 years ago. Except for his last quip, Dad kicked him out of the house for 3 weeks because of it. Mom also flipped her unholy SHT, I guess, because she wanted to be the only one to treat me like crap. I think Donald AITA has a third controller. I see Abraxas watching from the next room. They don't cost that much, and she seems super interested in playing with us. What he didn't know is that I had walked into the room behind him and listened to my surroundings. He'd spent the last few weeks complaining because a roommate had stolen his controllers to sell for drug money. I didn't care if this was a lie or not, but he had also tried to convince Donald to buy him a controller with money my brother didn't have for a month until he found out my brother didn't have a dime. So he was just moving up the ladder to get what he wanted. We don't need a third controller. And if I wanted to play Soul Calibur, I'd wait until you and Donald were done playing. I don't want to get in the middle of your time together since Donald has issues with me being in any room with him when he's on the PlayStation or you. Oh my god, Abraxas, you be. Andy spun around and looked pissed that the scapegoat he wanted to use to get what he wanted spoke up. Needless to say, he didn't get his way, and he huffed, puffed, and fumed like the entitled monster he was. In time, Andy realized that he also made no headway with Donald when Mom was involved, so he missed out on so many things, like sleeping over whenever he wanted without any warning, borrowing money, and having us buy him gifts and food. He also lamented that we didn't cook like his dad and weren't willing to completely change our diets to mimic Japanese cooking when he was over, because it was clearly the superior diet. He complained to me a lot about Mom when he was over, and Mom complained to me about Andy when he was gone. I never had any peace. A few other things about Andy. He had an electronic ankle bracelet like the one Martha Stewart had, and it ticked Dad off when he found out because the convictions that required those could have cost him his security clearance. Spoiler, I knew what he did, and he tried to play it off as no big deal, but clearly the law saw it differently. Andy didn't mind ruining our things as well, and had in fact warped the motherboard of my Xbox 360, and I had to replace it with my own money with a 360 arcade. The only thing he kind of did right was try to get Donald out of the house for terrible, selfish, entitled reasons. It took him half a year to convince my brother of this, and being interested in moving out myself, I decided to sit back and watch this go down, as it would help me get the hell out of this place successfully. Same thing I'd always done since middle school, really. Watch my brother go down in fire against Mom and improve my approach based on how that entitled worm fared. I watched the fight and had to give my mom some credit, as neither of them had money or any intentions to work. Were making plans on the assumption of getting social security checks, and had Andy's dad fill the gaps with his money. Andy tried for over an hour to debunk everything, but his bragging about how his dad lived, the contradictions he presented about his dad not being able to even pay certain bills, and his general unwillingness to do anything but watch TV and find reasons to quit every job he's ever had were more of a barrier to his goal of taking a doormat my brother with him out of our house. The family therapy sessions after this got really strained, and the therapist told Dad in private that he didn't think Mom would let Donald or I out of her sight because she liked the image of her kids living at home and the convenience of not having to do chores over our success as independent adults ready to stake our claim in the world. I believe the therapist too. Every suggestion to try and improve our relationship with each other was honored at first, and then twisted to benefit Mom. Kids need to learn how to cook before they can be independent. Somehow, I began cooking her a gourmet meal once a week, like any college students going to really go out of their way for chicken cordon bleu, shrimp scampi, or tikka masala. All you need is the food groups represented and cooked into something palatable and tasty. I kind of hate cooking now because of Mom, And my girlfriend honestly wishes I was more willing to cook these days. During this whole fiasco, Bubbles and I had been planning to move. And as a military brat, I knew how to do it across the state, while she hadn't really left the city before. It took a little convincing, but she agreed to save for the move, plan out expenses, arrange for a place to stay once we got to San Francisco, hire a roommate to help with expenses, and rent a moving van. I kept her up to date on what went down with Andy, and we hunkered down and saved up. It took me 2 weeks to work up the nerve and wait for the best time to approach Mom when we both felt confident about moving. It came in the summer, during a time when Andy hadn't been along for weeks. She was not pleased and pulled all the same tricks on me that had worked on my brother. With a spine and the knowledge of my brother's epic failure, I was more than prepared and fed up with taking the bull by the horns. "Hey Mom, I've been thinking about this for a long time. Don't interrupt me when I'm in the kitchen." I can't remember what it was, but it wasn't so life-threateningly important that she couldn't have listened. Regardless, I waited until she went back to the living room with the rest of the family. Donald was tuning out the world since he'd rather be in his room playing League, but Mom had dragged him out to socialize with her in the living room, and Dad was in his chair watching the evening news. "Mom, I've been thinking about something, and I feel it's time. Bubbles and I are moving to San Francisco in a few months. We scouted out the area with one of our friends last year. Remember Paperman from Yeekin? If you're underage, don't look that up. It's an 18-plus convention. He's going to be our roommate, and..." "You're what?" "Moving out. We've been saving up for a year for a moving van, and I was wondering if you..." "You can't move out. You don't have a job, and Bubbles gets government checks. I still have over $4,000 left after I was hit by that truck in high school, Mom. Both Bubbles and Paperman have those checks, so we'll be fine until I can get a job up there. What makes you think you'll do any better up there than here with your family? I bet you haven't even planned this out at all." As a military brat, I had a front row seat to every last move while we followed Dad about the country, so I knew my SHT very well, better than my girlfriend, and had even packed my own things impeccable for our last intercity moves. "We've been planning this for over a year, Mom, and saving up for it and the security deposit. Bubbles' parents can't take time off of work to drive a moving van, which is what I've been trying to ask you for help with. You've got a choice. Help us drive the stuff up and see the place for yourself, or stay here and only ever get an address." I left the living room and called Bubbles to let her know what I'd done, and I was trembling. I was sure Mom was going to barge into my room to scream, break my stuff, or threaten to kick me out, but nothing happened. The months that led up to the move were weirdly serene. Dad agreed to drive us north with a teacher of mine from college helping, and we were moved out of our parents' houses on our own and happy. I spent months just doing things I couldn't do at home. I spent 3 full days on the computer before my girlfriend got me off, and got all the free app games on my new cell phone that I could handle. I had several jobs, made new friends, and have been in low contact with that witch of a woman ever since. I know some of you may say I should go without contact, but some part of me yearns for that connection between my mom and me that my girlfriend and her mom have. To this day, my dad says he's proud of me for that day, the day I turned my back on Mom and didn't look back. I haven't. I wouldn't move back there. She can have that house and Donald all by herself since Dad divorced her. I just hope Donald won't regret his decisions since he refuses to see fault in her, and, to this day, still dates that parasite. Update. The day my brother cut off the tip of my finger. I'm not sure where this goes since it's a strange story that includes my entitled mom, questionable parenting decisions, a touch of revenge, and some questionable decisions. If you think this tale belongs in another sub, please let me know. The cast. Me, pretty self-explanatory. Donald is my little brother, who is just like Donald Duck, anger issues and all. There's guest appearances from my narcissistic mother and my BFF. This happened years ago, when I was in the 2nd grade. So many details are fuzzy, but what I do remember clearly is that my best friend ever, Bubbles, had invited me to her pizza birthday party. As a military brat, I wasn't usually anywhere long enough to make a friend, much less a good enough friend to be invited to a party, so I was absolutely ecstatic. Sure, the pizza place wasn't the best, but it was on a school night, and I was just so happy to have the opportunity. Not knowing what kind of present to get, I asked my mom, who asked Bubbles' mom, which led to a Disney princess-themed Barbie complete with an associated castle. I was delighted and anxious that she maybe wouldn't like it after Mom, and I spent hours in the now discontinued giraffe toy store. On the day of the party, the gift needed wrapping. Mom had put it in her closet to prevent tampering, and she usually wrapped presents since she didn't trust me or my younger brother, not to use an obscene amount of tape or wrapping paper. But it was my first time going to a party, and I absolutely insisted, to the point where she caved in. But only if her toady, my brother, got to help with the tape. Not seeing a problem other than having an awkward encounter with my brother before a party, I agreed. It was not much to wrap a pair of presents, except that Donald kept fingering the tape and getting his skin oils all over it, which made the tape not stick. He refused to give me a fresh bit until I ran to Mom to tell her about Donald rubbing the sticky side of the tape with his palms so I couldn't wrap the presents. Donald got a spanking for wasting tape and was allowed to continue after being forcefully made to observe how to remove tape from the dispenser by only holding the barest corner. He sulked and grumped, and I decided I wanted to add a bow made of curling ribbon. Mom was more than happy to get me a selection of colorful ribbons and scissors and praised us for how well wrapped the presents were. She left, and I was about to finish up with Donald being unpleasant when he spoke up. "Hey, Mom said you have to let me help." "You did help with the tape. This is the last part, and it'll only take a minute." "Mom said I had to help. You have to let me do the ribbon too. It's a part of the present." As a second grader, I couldn't figure out how to get around Donald's first grade logic. So I handed him the scissors and held the ribbon taut between my fingers so he could cut me a good length to curl. He put the scissors right against my finger and slowly started to apply the scissors to the ribbon. I realized I was going to lose skin and ran my finger down the ribbon away from the sharp edge, and he tried to pursue it, making an uneven cut. Wash, rinse, and repeat for every length of curling ribbon, with them all getting progressively longer as I tried to compensate for his stupidity. I asked him not to cut the ribbon while the scissors touched me, told him why, told him not to move the scissors when I moved my hand, etc. I really did try to include him without losing anything more than my patience with his bad attitude, and I admit now that I was complaining about how he was doing the ribbon cutting. I guess he was butthurt because I tattled on him being a butthole on the last ribbon. I said so, and that I could curl it, so he could get back to whatever he was doing before. I held the ribbon, and he started to cut. I moved, and he did too, faster than before, and he closed the scissors so quickly that I couldn't feel it at first. I looked at the cut end of the ribbon while my brother smirked with the scissors in hand, and I looked at the damage. I had a bad habit of chewing on my nails, so they were always short, and he had cut off that bit of skin that went from my fingertip to the end of my nail. When the pain and blood kicked in, I began to wail, and Dad was the first to arrive, followed by Mom. I don't remember Donald's punishment, but I do remember Dad intimidating Donald with the scissors and saying that he wanted me to have the tip of my finger back. And since Donald had taken it, Donald had to give up his. I was rushed to the bathroom by Mom to staunch the flow of blood, and I just cried because I didn't want to miss the party. I wanted to see my friend and give her the presents. She finished up the ribbon part of the present personally, and after promising we could leave if the bandage turned the slightest bit pink, we were on our way. I went to the party with my finger bandaged, and it was great. Bubbles loved her presents, and I consumed my weight in bad pizza and fountain drinks. The next day in school, Bubbles gushed about her party at the pizza place. Update. Entitled Mom demands a disabled daughter get a job and forces homelessness as motivation. This story started weeks after this jam, back in 2017, when Mom cost me my job at NOAA. I couldn't say they loved me there, but I was treated with fondness as their first, and then only student hire from community college. I had a cupcake hand delivered to me by the department lead for my birthday, and on the last day I was there, someone had snuck out to the UC new hire luncheon to get me a cake to see me off on my last day. I felt validated and worthwhile, and I was treated like an adult for the first time in my life working there. Edit. It looks like I confused some people. Let me try to clarify some concerns from the comments to clear up certain confusion. This occurred in 2007, and yes, I did eventually move out in 2013. My medical condition is called septo-optic nerve dysplasia, and it's identified as an underdevelopment of the optic nerve and/or pituitary gland. As the pituitary gland is responsible for human development, and this is the most common expression of SOD. Sufferers of the condition rarely develop physically or mentally past kindergarten or first grade. Yes, I've met some of them. It makes me sad knowing I'm so normal compared to them, and that this is a birth defect with no cure currently. Edit 2. I woke up today to a huge chunk of comments missing. I'm not sure if it was moderators or the users themselves, but we did reconcile like adults before bed, and were on agreeable terms. I never wanted them to be harassed over a small mistake like mistaking the post origin for one from another sub. I hope the commenter is okay. TLDR. Entitled Mom demands a disabled daughter get a job. Even if they aren't suitable for the work, Dad saves the day. I moped my way through the rest of my courses, scraping by passing grades, and lay about the house through the weeks between the spring and summer semesters. I had never done the summer classes before and didn't plan on it, now when Mom decided once again to take offense. I was refusing to surrender my time to work in the garden with her. I wasn't talking about finding a new job, and I didn't seem to care about her arbitrary punishments, which I bet good money pissed her off the most. One week, I found myself too harassed to get dressed and shoved out the front door with her. A finger-width shy of shouting that I needed to go to Copy Ninja to print my resume and don't come back until 4 p.m., and that I better have applied to no less than 10 jobs that day. I found she'd packed my purse and set it in the front mailbox. By this time, most places had a kiosk by customer service where you could apply online in store. And the only places that did same-day interviews weren't the kind of places that treated you with any kind of respect. Knowing it was pointless to argue this through the locked front door, I slumped to the bus to do as I was told. Every day for a week, I obediently went store to store trying to apply for work. And most of the time I was directed online and never got an interview. Mom allowed me to tell her where I'd gone for a walk-in and huffed at the end of the week that I must not be trying if I didn't have a job yet. It turns out she expected me to walk into no less than 10 stores a day and interview. Like when she was a girl, when things were less expensive and technology hadn't streamlined a lot of employment processes. In week 2 of being kicked out daily, I found that I could better spend my time going to 3 different public libraries and spending an hour at each on the internet applying for entry-level positions, as I had a membership card. Still no interviews, since it was summer. This was also the only consistent air conditioning I had, and I'd taken to sneaking a snack from home and buying a single meal from a fast food place a day, so I wouldn't starve. I found out I had a limit on my debit card when meals were being declined, and I walked into my bank's local branch to raise the limit so I could continue to eat. Thank God the Mermaid Coffee Co. gave me free water, so I was able to stay hydrated. In week 3, I decided to go on campus to apply for work, and found the library was open, so I could skim off a lot of travel time and apply for work on the internet efficiently. I had a student ID, so campus police assumed I had classes, but I was pretty much in the library from the time it opened to nearly 4 p.m. with AC all day every day while I dug around for any tip or trick to making managers hire me after an interview, and take small breaks for flash games since all work and no play makes for dulled senses. Mom had taken to pulling the LAN cable that went to my room from the router to keep me from playing games, and somehow didn't seem to understand me telling her every day for weeks that places didn't want to walk in with a printed resume. All time spent on a computer, for work, school, or coursework, was gaming to her, and she would barge into whatever room she liked to glow at your screen to try and catch you at it. Even though I was never as much of an addict for PC games as my brother, she was convinced I wasn't really trying and promised that if I didn't have an interview soon, there'd be consequences. By week 6, Mom is quite upset that I seem to be neglecting the fast food industry. Because of my disability, I'm a liability in the kitchen, and I don't have any food handling certification. Not only that, but I had some pride. If I was going to put myself in constant danger at work, I better be getting hazard pay, which was only for careers I was not qualified for, and that my disability would not allow. I had gotten an interview by this time for a realtor's office, but they hadn't called me back for a second interview. I was trying, and I really was, but as long as businesses don't say to your face that they aren't hiring you because of the unknown cost of accommodating a disability, they can leave you out of their hiring pool without repercussions. Meanwhile, my entitled brother Donald got to sleep all day, play games on the PS4, and didn't have to help in the garden as he maliciously mangled every plant he touched. He only had to cook 1 meal for the family a week while his parasitic boyfriend came over daily for free food and internet. He also chipped in on telling me what a failure I was during this whole ordeal, and parroted Mom's word at me without any opinion of his own, because he's a doormat to the most emotionally and mentally manipulative person in the immediate area. I had tried every trick I had learned from the Disabled Students Programs and Services, Department of Rehabilitation and Workability, to find work anything that I was capable of doing. I applied to places that advertised hiring the disabled, and did as DOOR and DSPS had said to try and convince businesses to take me, as the government encouraged companies to hire a percentage of their workforce from the disabled as a tax write-off. No place I told about my vision ever called me back. And I learned that just because they could hire me didn't mean they had to, as long as a percent of the company's total workforce qualified as disabled. My eating habits meant I was losing weight, which would have been okay if the diet wasn't causing my anemia iron deficiency, not the well-known deadly one, to flare up. I was emotionally, mentally, and physically exhausted as the deadline for this unspecified consequence loomed, and the interviews I'd had were being ignored in favor of this punishment. Doomsday arrived, and I woke early to the sound of a bad morning. Since childhood meant violence and abuse, I found I didn't want to get out of bed. Not a choice I had as Mom barged into my room and flipped me off my bed drill sergeant style before she began emptying clothes, intimate items, and socks into a suitcase. A woman who hadn't worked a paying job since 1993, while I had worked 4 since the early 2000s, was kicking me out as if it were the most normal thing ever. I had a large settlement from a car accident to my name, and I was out on the streets that same morning looking like I was going to the airport, ears ringing with my mom's words to get a job or never return. I used a payphone to tell my girlfriend what had happened and that I was homeless. She was worried, and I'd kept this entire ordeal from her to this point, as confrontations like this worried her and caused anxiety. She lived in her parents' house with her 2 little sisters in a 3-bedroom house with 2 medium-sized dogs. As tempting as it may have been to ask, I knew from when we hung out together that there was no room for another person. And I didn't want to impose, not like that. Not as a parasite. I valued my GF's mom's opinion of me, as that woman is, to me, the perfect example of a fair but firm mother who loved without restriction and was loved by her family. I can't remember how Dad found out what had happened, as Mom threw me out while he was at his contractor job. But I remember he found me a cheap hotel near the Marine recruitment base to stay in, for which I was grateful. The only comforts I had were the Nintendo DS and charger I'd hidden in the lining of my purse, my monthly bus pass, the Mermaid Coffee Co., water, and knowing that the people who really cared about me were worried. I stayed there for a week, paying $50 a day, getting a complimentary continental breakfast in the morning, my daily fast food, and a snack that I bought from a dollar store as I labored, stressed, and cried trying to fulfill Mom's requirements. On the second day of my exile, I got a visit from her with home-cooked food and a snide comment about how I had made this so hard for myself by being a lazy, entitled person who thought they could leech off their parents. It hurt hearing that, as I was the one going to college, and who had slaved away for 2 months prior trying to find work, while my brother did exactly what she'd said with his parasite boyfriend, whom Mom loathed. After a week, I packed up and moved to another motel across the street, which didn't offer a complimentary breakfast, so I dropped back to 1 meal a day and 1 snack. I had gotten Dad's work cell number, and he told me a time I could call him so we could talk, which I did to the best of my ability with the room phone. He promised to find a way for me to come home, and while I never wanted to be back under Mom's control, I was going through my settlement money faster than I liked, as this new place was a fair bit more expensive. Dad delivered. I don't know how, but he got Mom to agree to let me come back if I signed up for the fall semester, and sent her a printout of the transcript. I'm ashamed to say I took this escape from a homeless life and back into that dumpster fire of a parent's care. But even then, I'd learned things. She honestly didn't care if I was medically unsuited for certain types of work, and was willing to put me at risk to achieve whatever selfish goal she had for these past few months. Her ideals on how to find a job were out of date, and she refused to admit that she was wrong or that times had changed. I knew I had to get out of that house. Mom was a creature of habit, and whenever she learned a new trick to get what she wanted, she resorted to overusing it to get whatever she wanted, regardless of the consequences for those around her. Update. Entitled mother, and I went without contact after she finally got the divorce she wanted for over 20 years. This tale is going to be long, in part because of the backstory. Mom had always said she never threatens. She makes promises, and through my young life, this was one of the few promises she kept religiously. If she said she was going to take everything you own to Goodwill, if you don't do whatever she wants, and you don't break your back to do it right away, you will return one day to an empty room with only the bare minimum essentials and a mess to clean up because she took everything she didn't think you needed to Goodwill, which should have been illegal, but it isn't. Oh, the joy of being the child of an entitled narcissist parent. TLDR. Entitled mom was served the divorce she wanted for 20 years, and I went out of contact with her during it. The backstory. The trial run of the divorce happened when my brother and I were in middle school. Mom was highly dissatisfied with her marriage, which isn't that uncommon in the military. She was an Air Force brat, married into the Navy, and had kids with special needs. She had phases of acceptance of Dad and me that were practically seasonal and predictable, so we huddled together to weather the storms of her ire and loath to make it to the times of strained tolerance. This time, Dad was weeks away from returning home from a deployment when the SHT hit the fan, and she was surly angry, and indulging in a common narcissistic parent trait of forcing her teenage kids into adult problems called parentification. Mom's grievances were quite long, some legitimate. Some she made for herself through words and actions that were routinely manipulative and abusive. One was that Dad wasn't emotionally present. Another was that he didn't balance the checkbook and was terrible at managing his money. If it weren't for her, he'd have spent everything on himself, which wasn't true. We didn't have much family savings, but we never starved. We always had essentials and some amenities. I forget the rest. But she had a bulleted list of 30 separate things, half of which she caused through the abuses and manipulations she heaped on all of us. Some she had influence over but chose to aggravate, and the rest were fairly legit. Then she dropped the bomb about the divorce, and that she would be taking us, and that she'd already emptied the joint account she had with Dad and moved the money to her personal bank account. We didn't know what to do with this information, and I know my jaw bounced off the floor before I found my voice to say I'd rather go with Dad. It was impossible, of course, since he was enlisted, which she delightedly pointed out. I was so proud of Donald when he declared he'd rather go with Nana, our maternal grandmother, and Mom vetoed that hardcore, which given her father's preferences, I get why now, and I am glad she did that for me. The only thing Mom hadn't done was get the papers, and she was waiting for Dad to return. But during that time, my brother and I acted out and misbehaved daily, as children caught in the middle of a divorce are prone to. My brother aggressively picked fights with kids older and younger than himself all the time and got suspended weekly. I took to stealing food and treats from the house to sell at school for some extra cash, since Mom hadn't gotten her head out of her arse to let us have an allowance. And I had an idea that I could buy a bus ticket to Texas if I worked hard enough at it. I also stole a multi-tool from my brother, which I used to rip staples and nails from the telephone pole I stood by when waiting on the bus. I didn't hide it well, so I ran afoul of zero-tolerance policies and got expelled. It was a time of our lives that I'm still not proud of that involved the police being called over a lot, because of the screaming matches and the fighting almost daily. All the while, Mom maintained the air of a poor, suffering housewife who did no wrong and was wronged by her abusive military husband, as she tried to goad him into starting the divorce process the moment he got home. I'm not sure why he had to start it, but it's what Mom wanted. Dad had never raised his hands to anyone like Mom had, but every few days, Mom grabbed one of us, dragged us about the house like a meat shield, and screamed at Dad to be left alone. It was a terrible time, and I reached out to Nana crying after one of the meat shield incidents because Mom had swung me into a door frame while turning a corner to escape, and it felt like my nose was broken. It wasn't, but I needed someone to cry to who wasn't my best friend, Bubbles. This seemed like salvation at the time. Nana dropped in on us in her champagne Silverado like a knight in armor riding a unicorn and dressed Mom down in front of the entire family. She called Mom selfish for not considering the damage she was causing her daughter and family, and she accused her of going out of her way to try and get Dad to take out his gun. She had no idea before that we ever had one in the house, so she could get him arrested, etc. Grandma ended by pointing out to Mom that one of her high school friends had gone through her parents' divorce when Mom was my age and became a teenage baby factory who dropped out of school and got into drugs. The divorce fizzled out not long after, but nothing was ever the same as Mom passively-aggressively tried to upset Dad from time to time and threatened divorce if he ever upset her too much. The fuss over paperwork intimidated Dad at the time, so he refused to file just because Mom was acting beer than normal. I guess you could call us sponges for this kind of thing because we had a high tolerance, but it was a lesser of two evils to let her be and hope the next day would be better. She swore that she'd ruin Dad if the divorce ever happened, swore she'd take him for everything he was worth, and adamantly believed Donald and I would pick her over him. Spoilers, I didn't. This whole traumatic experience never left me because she never threatens. She makes promises, and I knew I'd see this Pandora's box open again in the future. I came to realize that what Nana had done wasn't salvation, but a stay of judgment. And that hammer was getting heavier by the year. Now the story you've all been waiting for. Now that that's over and you understand a little bit about her pettiness, I must preface the real meat of the story with the fact that Mom hasn't worked a paying job since the early 90s. She volunteered like it was going out of style, which looks great on a resume, but it means nothing if you don't use said resume to become financially independent. She depended on her husband's salary and had cut all ties with her parents at the encouragement of her therapist years before to address her childhood trauma during the time I was living independently in a different part of the same state. The divorce hammer was reaching critical mass. Both Mom and Donald had been excluding Dad from their lives despite living in the same house together since 2004. Mom's harassment of him had escalated to the point where she didn't even want him to go to the kitchen for food or drink because he walked past the living room, where she spent her free time daily. He bought himself a mini fridge that he kept in the master bedroom closet, so he wouldn't have to leave his little sanctuary with its locked door and connected bathroom. He also had taken to consuming a lot of alcohol, which I know isn't healthy. But given the other things he could have done, it was the lesser evil, since marriage counseling, family counseling, and individual counseling had done nothing to try and correct the downward spiral of the relationship. Mom, being what she is, she ordered Donald to use one of his tools to unlock the sanctuary door so she could berate Dad daily for escapism, as he had a fridge, TV, and PS3 in his room. And every time Dad retreated further into the master bathroom, which Donald couldn't jiggle open to wait out Mom until she stopped banging on the door and left. Eventually, he'd scream insults right back at her, which I heard over the phone when I called on the relevant parents' holidays, Christmas, and birthdays. In 2016, I'd consented to visit for Christmas, and I didn't spend much time at their home, as I stubbornly protected every last minute of my time when it came to her. We weren't over the top for Christmas, but it was Dad's favorite holiday ever since he was a boy, and he always did the lion's share of the decorating. Lights, getting a tree after Thanksgiving, picking said tree with the family, and getting new themed decorations if Mom wanted to mix things up a bit. You could see the care and attention put into the interior and exterior setup, and I enjoyed seeing how happy he was. Even if the house was slightly hazardous for me, with all the breakables I could come into contact with. This year, there was only the tree, no ornaments, bare minimum lights, no stockings, no presents, and Dad was miserable. It turns out that last year's meager decorations, which were just getting a tree to decorate, were like pulling teeth for him to get Donald into. And this year Dad was burned out trying to involve people who didn't want him in their lives. He pulled me aside after opening my present to say this would be the last Christmas I'd see them all together. From here, it's all things I learned through texts, as Mom liked to make me the middle person in her fights, and I tried to emotionally support my dad as I had ever since elementary school. Yes, I know this is considered bad, but I never asked to be forced into emotionally adult situations before I was actually considered an adult. And I refused to be her middle person to snitch on Dad, or vice versa. At last, Mom's bullshit got her what she wanted. It only took blowing up on an artist at a public show to mail a commission to Dad's office. It seems the benefits of serving Mom after the divorce outweighed the drawbacks, and he got the ball rolling, making itemized lists with the costs and receipts of things he wanted and things he wanted Mom to have. Apparently the lawyer was impressed, as men don't usually go into this kind of detail. But Dad said they would understand when he started working with Mom. Mom got wind of this, and somehow, despite threatening it for over 20 years, she didn't seem to want it. She woke up before sunrise daily to make herself breakfast and lunch and left the house in her car, never going to the same part of town twice a week and detouring every time she thought someone was following her, only to return home at midnight to start that cycle up again. She did this for 3 months, and Donald had to support her and stonewall Dad. Dad couldn't serve Mom personally, and the lawyer associate who served papers only made 3 attempts before it was on Dad to somehow get the job done without handing it over himself. He knew Mom was trying to gather evidence of cheating something, anything to use against him. But in the end, one of Dad's co-workers cornered Mom in the house and shoved the papers through a nearly closed door, while Mom threatened to call the cops and screamed like a banshee. It's not the best way to do it, I'll be honest, and I felt kind of bad for the situation. But Mom made her bed months prior, and now she was lying in it. After this, Mom made a support group chat via texts that was made up of her few close friends who didn't question her when she cried and complained about Dad, which included a woman who divorced her ex a year prior. This person thought I ought to be more supportive of Mom instead of questioning her over things she said that I felt didn't add up to my experience growing up with her. This friend and I disagreed, as the friend's trauma was recent, and she blindly ate all Mom's crap due to her recent experience and being presented only half the story. My trauma was long-term, and I'd seen my mom's true face and entitlement, unlike the rest of them. We agreed not to speak to each other after that since we couldn't reconcile a difference of opinion about Mom. This chat was all love, kindness, and support for Mom, which she did kind of need from more than just Donald. But at the same time, I was borderline physically ill, as they told Mom she was blameless. They didn't know this dumpster fire like I did, hadn't lived her two-faced lying and manipulations, and didn't know the details she was omitting, like why it took Dad 3 months to serve her, or why she went to such lengths to avoid the one thing she seemed to have wanted for years. It turns out the Marine-based divorce attorney was backed up 4 months deep, and she wanted to see him before she got served so she could serve Dad instead. She nearly made it, But she conveniently forgot to mention this to make it look like she was afraid for her life, living with an alcoholic, who suddenly started getting really interested in where she was all the time. She was saying how she had to hide out at her newest nonprofit at odd hours, and how she was sure Dad had paid a guy to harass her on and off campus. Mom never threatens. She makes promises. The support group didn't know what she planned to do to Dad, how she planned to do it, or when, but I did. I used to sit trapped at home for hours with her digging her talons into my arm in middle school and being forced to listen to how she had planned to destroy Dad back then. And I remembered it all. She was going to take this nuclear or burn every bridge trying. Dad's security clearance was sensitive. Any kind of arrest or having someone with the wrong convictions in the family, or as a family friend, could get it revoked. But the job paid well, and he came to it with everything he learned in the military, so it was easy to get said clearance initially. Despite his drinking, he avoided legal trouble and distanced himself from Donald's boyfriend, Andy. Losing this job would hurt Mom and Donald, but it would hurt Dad's prospects for future employment more, which is what she was going to be after. Mom came to the chat saying Dad had attacked her, and she'd broken her 4th and 5th metatarsals while defending herself, along with a picture of her bandaged hand at the doctor's office and the x-ray. For those of you who don't know, this kind of damage is commonly called a boxer's break and happens when you hit something with a closed fist. It's not a defensive injury by nature. Praise, sympathy, and support were showered on her, and I cautiously asked if she was okay and if she was going to press charges. My response was a cryptic thanks for being concerned. She was on painkillers for the injury, and she'd keep us updated. One of the people in the chat said she should press charges, but there was no response to that either. I waited a few days and asked again if she was going to press charges privately, and I got the same response as in the group chat. It was a direct paste with a timestamp of the original comment, which told me she was doing what she did best: to lie through omission and put her hypocrisy on display for anyone able to read her like a book. If she hadn't pressed charges yet, she was in the middle of it. I texted Dad to see what his side of the tale was and was able to piece together what happened using both sides and their known tendencies to exaggerate, just like Mom had taught me to do. Lesson learned, Mom. There are as many sides to a story as there are people who have seen the incident, and I was going to find out what really happened. It seems it went like this. Pissed about being served, Mom had barged into the master bedroom to confront Dad, who followed legal orders and wasn't responding to her accusations and demands. He set down his game controller and got up from sitting on the bed to walk away from the confrontation. Enraged, Mom punched him in the back, and with a swaying knee, he went down like a ton of bricks, partially onto the bed, and had to scramble to his feet as she readied for another punch. He booked it to the master bedroom with more speed than you think a guy his size was capable of, and Mom missed her second punch during the pursuit, hitting the closet instead, knocking the cheap door off its hinges, and breaking her hand, all while screaming profanities. They both called the cops while he developed a bruise near his kidneys, and he swiftly packed up his clothes and everything he could into his truck. Mom's initial statement to the cops was as she had texted to us with Donald, saying Dad had never ever hit Mom, and tonight was no exception, even though he heard Mom hit the closet. He changed his statement later so Mom could file for a restraining order against Dad, which was granted, and he had to move out with all he could reasonably do to comply. I spent an entire weekend looking up everything I could about California divorce law. If Mom was going to do what she had said 20 years ago, I wanted to know what kind of pity party she'd tried to throw for herself in the group chat. What it boiled down to was that since their marriage was over 10 years and Dad was the primary source of income, Mom would be entitled to a percentage of his earnings as ordered by a judge until a time set by the judge, where she proved she was financially independent enough to support herself. If she wanted to stay in that house, she needed Dad to work, and she was too set in her ways to get a job herself. I texted Mom one last time privately to see if she was going to press charges against Dad for the attack, and I got the same "thanks for the concern" message as I had before, this time without the original timestamp. I was being stonewalled. She was putting her head in the sand to avoid hearing anything that didn't support her views, and she knew I had never blindly accepted her version of events when it came to Dad. I always dug a little bit more to find the real truth, and my track record for that was nearly perfect, with her lying blatantly or through omission about whatever it was that had happened to make him look bad and herself innocent. I waited a week, hoping she'd respond to my private text. I was hoping I was wrong about what she was going to do. So far, everything that went down went exactly as she'd said years ago. But it hadn't been nearly as successful as she had claimed it would be back then, likely because there were no minors involved this time. There was no response, and I had to make a choice. keep my silence and watch my brother go down in flame with her, since he had no opinion outside Mom's, or speak up and know that if he went down in flame, I'd done my best to try and discourage Mom from a course of action that would backfire. I went to the group chat to share what I'd learned about what may happen during the divorce, and to say that if Mom pressed charges, Dad could lose his job, and that without his money, she'd not be able to continue renting the house. It was unwise to cost Dad employment when Donald only worked at a deli counter at a grocery store, and the job market was harder now than ever, so she wouldn't find it easy to get a job herself. That being as petty as she swore she would be since 1998 would cost her more than one can reasonably afford in the state of California. I knew she would be mad, but I had tried to take this up with her privately and was ignored, so I was going to put it somewhere she couldn't ignore. The group chat was silent for all of 5 hours before Mom dropped a message I keep to this day to remind me never to feel sorry for her ever again. Before removing me from that chat to have her pity party, I had the joy of her friend, who had been through divorce, already asking me how I learned this and why I hadn't gone to Mom privately, which I said I had. But she was ignoring my texts. I kept the conversation, even after 2 years, so I could see the following message every time I started to feel bad for her about the divorce, because it went exactly as I had warned. Friends, I'm sorry about my daughter Abraxas Sirens' remarks, as she doesn't understand that this forum is to update you. All personal responses should be handled personally. I believe I have removed her from this conversation and will confirm with the phone company today. Please block her number. Again, I'm sorry for putting you in this uncomfortable position, which I didn't foresee happening. Entitled Mother. I assumed I was blocked, so I didn't try to reach out to test it. If she wanted to go without contact because I shamed her in a group chat when she refused to talk to me at all in private, that was her problem. We'd been in low contact for 7 years, and not having to babysit her text conversations, so she wouldn't blow up my phone for ignoring her would be a blessing. I never shared with either parent what the other was doing. I never posted on social media what was going on other than to say I was worried about my brother. Dad was suspended for a while, and his clearance was reevaluated. But he stayed open about the proceedings and kept his boss current on the situation, showing the police report of being attacked by his wife and the doctor's assessment of the damage to his back and knees from the fall. He got to keep his job, but had to move into a hotel, and he obeyed his lawyer's advice to the letter. The proceedings were as ugly as you can imagine, with Mom burning through 2 military divorce lawyers to find one she wanted, and making her own list of demands for things she wanted from the proceedings. It turns out she wanted half of everything's monetary value, and all Dad wanted were the items in the house that were his, or that were bought with his tastes in mind, which were of lesser value than what he offered to let her keep. As he was moving back to his hometown in Texas, he was to bring me my things that I left back home and was never able to bring with me. The part about my things didn't go as planned, and it took 7 months for it to get ironed out. The judge had ordered the percentage of income Dad made for the next several years to go to Mom, but also that Mom had to have a job within a few years. She was ordered to show her lawyer proof of seeking employment by presenting 10 proofs a week, which somehow she wasn't able to do, having only presented 3 a week. Remember, I had to apply to 10 places a day and give her proof back when she kicked me out for 2 weeks. The restraining order was also overruled after Dad's attorney pointed out that Donald's statement had changed from the initial police report to the approval of the RO. It also turns out that since Donald was a legal adult, he never should have been lumped under Mom's restraining order as a minor, and instead applied for his own separately. Apparently, this was news to Donald. But the restraining order had done its damage, and Dad gets to have fun with cops when pulled over as they make sure he doesn't have any outstanding warrants for the duration of the order. His lawyer warned him about this. The only contact I had with Mom for a year after this whole mess were screenshots of her phone when I forgot to pay my part of the phone plan, to which I never responded but paid promptly so I wouldn't have to. After I got a notice from our phone company that a line was added or removed, I freaked out because I thought she'd found a new level of pettiness. But it seems she finally allowed Donald to have a phone and added him as her secondary line. Guess her percentage of unemployment meant she needed help with her bills. I'm glad Donald has one. He can play Pokemon Go and do all the things we always wanted to do if we ever had phones growing up. Dad is a lot happier and spends time with one of his favorite sisters and some old high school friends they know. He has a new job that pays just as well as the old one. He's undertaking therapy, has scaled back a lot of his drinking, and is losing weight. Pandemic willing, I want to spend Christmas with him and my aunt. I never got to know Dad's side of the family because Mom would never allow it growing up, and I was told horror stories about the mill. In mid-November 2019, Mom texted me, saying Papa had died. It's no apology. It wasn't meant to be. It meant she was free of a shadow that had hung over her since she was a little girl and dominated every part of her life. She never apologized when she was wrong, but she reached out after being as catty as a high school girl. I guess in her way, it's an apology and all I deserve in her eyes. I know I'm the arsehole for calling Mom out in front of her friends. I'm not debating that. I acted with the intent to try and wake her up, because I knew her better than anyone there, and didn't want her to be homeless with only my brother to support her since she cut all ties with any family that could have supported her. But I refused to apologize for it until she did. I've given up on too many things because of her, and I'm not letting go of this. Update. My entitled brother doesn't mind putting me at risk, as long as he does less yard work. Hello Reddit. I usually post to entitledparents and have mentioned my brother, whom I label as entitled without really supporting the claim. So I figured I'd rectify that situation and put him on the shame pedestal. Those of you familiar with my writings know the cast, but if you're new to Tales of Woe, let's break it down. Also, this started in the late 90s and continued into the early 2010s when I moved the heck out. Me, OP, visually disabled nerd. Donald. My entitled brother, who's just like Donald Duck. Guest appearances by my parents as required. TLDR. My entitled brother is a lazy SHT who does not mind putting me at risk, just so that he doesn't have to spend any time doing his chores. This was our battle from elementary through high school and into college. This all started after Mom hurt her foot well. Not so much as a bone spur, which triggered 2 opposing tendons in her foot to the point where surgery was the only fix. She used to do all the lawn work, and we had a gopher problem, so she'd twist her hurt foot in the gopher holes, and one day she'd had enough. After limping into the house, she declared that Donald and I were doing the lawns weekly and sorting out the distribution of labor ourselves. Something to note. We had an old gas-powered mower and a 1-gallon refill tank. Dad spent an hour showing us how to use the mower and check the oil and gas tanks, how to refill them, and instructed us that we should never put fresh gas in the tank while the motor was hot, etc. Dad also showed us the sound the motor made when it was low on gas, which alternated from normal to lower-pitched sputtering. This chore had some simple rules. Some were original to the chore, and some were added because of Donald and me, but I'm not telling you which is what. Do not leave your clippings in the mower when the entire lawn is done. And don't leave your clippings in the mower if you mow first. Do not mow without the clipping bag attached to the mower, or you will clean it up. If you empty the refill gas can, you refill the can. When doing the backyard, you're to poop scoop and remove all the dog's toys so nothing is damaged that shouldn't be, and to prevent spreading the poop in a fine brown mist. Do not run over the sprinklers. Under no circumstances are you to play on electrics or slack off, if you must wait for the other sibling to finish using some equipment. If you empty the spool of weed whacker wire, you are to tell a parent so a replacement can be bought. Do not waste weed whacker wire by extending more for any minor reduction in the exposed length. Under no circumstances are you to unplug the weed whacker when it's running. Do not destroy the invisible fence wire. Now trained in the use of the mower, Donald and I initially agreed to swap lawn duties since we had to first mow the grass, then use a weed whacker to edge the yards to make sure the sidewalks and driveway looked good. Both tasks were laborious, but mowing was easier as you didn't have to bend over all that much. We swapped who did the mowing and the edging every week, but Donald decided one day he didn't want to swap tasks or yards, and he complained to Mom, who declared we'd each do either the entire front yard or the entire backyard, edging included, and I added that we still needed to swap yards, which she didn't contest at the time. You see, we lived at the end of a cul-de-sac in military housing, so the front yard was significantly smaller than the backyard. And given how lazy Donald was, I knew he'd try to dominate the smaller yard, which only took 20 minutes to finish, unlike the backyard, which took an hour due to its irregular shape and size. He grumbled for all of 2 weeks and complied. That's how long it took for him to realize how much more work the backyard was. Now he wanted to only do the smaller yard and threw a fit to get what he wanted, which of course he got as the golden child. As it had always been between us, I went to Dad. But the only compromise I got for being made to do the backyard every time was that Donald had to pick up after our dog every other week, no negotiation, and that the front yard was first come, first served. So we now had to fight for the easier yard work. The competition was fierce, with me using Donald's laziness and love of gaming to get into the front yard edgewise, and him using tactics that put the mower at risk of breaking to get the desired yard, while I fixed the situations he caused the week before. What were the situations you asked about? The gas tank. Another rule of the mower was that if you empty the refill tank, you had to ask a parent for money and walk 5 minutes to the nearest gas station to refill it. Many times, I watched Donald empty it and neglect that he had one job when it came to refilling the tank. He either flat out refused to ask for the cash or claimed he'd do it later and forget. So guess who would get a few minutes into the front yard mowing before the motor started going? Most of the time, it was me, since an eighth of the tank would let you finish the front yard at least, but wouldn't even make a dent in the backyard. Apparently, it was my fault for not checking that the refill can was full before mowing. And if Donald got started on the edging of the front yard while I was fixing his oversight, that was my problem too. I hated Donald because he knew better, but like my disability, it was a menial detail he couldn't be bothered to remember, his words exactly. If you're curious how forgetting to refill a gas tank can cause such a delay, Hollywood has gasoline explosions about right. Putting gasoline in something hot can cause an explosion. And since explosions could make me go blind, I took that part of personal and equipment safety seriously, which cost me routinely with this chore. My prize was an extra 15 minutes waiting for the engine to cool down to a safe temperature before I could resume the chore. Eventually, I was so fed up with having to fight for equal treatment from Mom that I just accepted that Donald would get away with being the lazy pile of crap he was, and that I was going to be punished if I even lifted a finger against him when it came to yard work. I took unending joy in taking my time using the weed whacker, since Donald's childish behavior often meant I would have had to clean up his messes with the mower from the week before. And by choosing not to start with it, he would have to do the cleanup himself, while I made sure I did the backyard perfectly to avoid Mom's wrath. This is how all chores like this went with my brother. It was a cold war of trying to do only the minimum of what we were required to do, while Donald tried to do less and force his work onto me. Mom would inevitably side with Donald, as clearly her disabled daughter, who can't see well, was being entitled and trying to force her poor younger brother to do more than his fair share. Several rules were made as I played the dirty sibling rivalry game to expose Donald to him taking a 3-hour break between aspects of yard work, so he could clear just one more dungeon to how he used up all of the backup weed whacker wire, which caused problems when Dad was deployed once. He tried to get back at me by not emptying the clipping bag 1 week before stowing the mower, which I knew, so I took the all-whacker and watched him realize the mess he'd made for himself. Donald tried to avoid cleanup by mowing without the clipping bag attached, since it was filled with smelly, dried, and molding clippings. Big mess and mistake, since he now had to sweep the street and rake the lawn to collect every last blade of grass and empty the clipping bag. It was delicious watching him stick his hand into the clipping bag to scoop out the old clippings into the composting bin along with the new clippings, and I drank in every second of his misery. To work around the issues of the gas tank, I'd have to call on Dad every Sunday when we did the lawn so he could watch Donald empty the tank and pounce on Donald to shove a $5 bill into his hand. Dad glowered at my brother's back as he walked down the street with the red refill can, all while Donald grumbled about me being a bee. Donald hated it. But if he wasn't so focused on playing games, these measures wouldn't have to be taken. Donald felt very inconvenienced about being made to do the things he honestly ought to be doing. And come the summer when the grass grew the fastest, Mom gave him a new chore to balance the work he did in the front yard against what I was doing in the backyard from the beginning. I say balance because an attempt was made. But in all honesty, using the garden hose to water potted plants on the back patio isn't that hard and only takes 5 minutes max if you don't mess around. So his yard chores took a grand total of half an hour, while mine took twice as long if I hadn't been sabotaged that day by Donald or distracted by other tasks by Mom partway through. He hated watering the pots and oversprayed them like it was going out of style to try and convince Mom that he was incompetent at gardening, and that it was a waste of water and time to make him do it. We lived in Southern California, so water conservation was very important. Neither parent budged, and every time he drowned one of Mom's plants, he got himself a spanking, even as a middle school student, and was dragged to the garden section or nursery, where the dead plant came from to get Mom a replacement, usually with me in tow, to get Dad a new sprinkler head. This was somehow my fault. If you've never mowed before, grass lays flat and won't get cut evenly if done while it's wet. Donald took it upon himself to spray down a 10-foot swath of the backyard every time he had to do his extra chore, and at first I avoided the affected area to mow once dry, because I didn't like how much it itched when the wet clippings hit my legs. Mom didn't like it and insisted I do all the mowing at the same time after Donald pointed it out, which is how I learned about the wet grass problem and the uneven cutting that came from it, which meant time was lost waiting on a swath or grass that had initially been in the shade of the house to dry once the sun hit it. My explanations on the patchiness and why I had to save the part nearest the back patio where last were ignored and Donald got to enjoy his pettiness while Mom screamed at me. Took away any chance I had to talk on the phone or use the computer that the school had loaned me so I could do homework for a week. All while he sat in his room on his Game Boy playing his games between mowing and edging until I ruined that for him. This went on throughout the summer, and every time I asked Donald to please not overspray because it affected my yard work, and each time he'd stare me down and do just that, claiming it was an accident or that he was playing with the dog. When Dad saw me avoiding the wet area, he asked, and I spilled the tea. After that, Donald was made to mow any part of the backyard he sprayed when watering Mom's plants, and it's amazing how quickly he became competent at using a water hose and didn't have to get replacement plants. He still resented that he had to wait for whatever bit of equipment I was using, and in an effort to throw his entitlement and wait around, he decided he wasn't going to wait to finish his chore. I was. I remember this exchange pretty well as it spawned one of the dumbest amendments to the rules listed at the top of the post. Note: the weed whacker was electric and had to be plugged in to be used by way of an extra long extension cord on a reel, and our outside outlets had weather covers that kept rainwater from getting inside them. I was weeding peacefully, bent over double and holding the weed whacker awkwardly as I had to have control of the business end. I was maybe a quarter of the way through the task when Donald had finished mowing the front yard, and with the rule about electronics, he would be miserably unplugged until I was done in 20 minutes or so. He must have had a play date or gotten a brand new game, because this time he grabbed the cord about 3 feet from the plug and yanked it out of the outlet, which I shouldn't have to point out is bad for the health of any electronic. Me. Turning to see if it was Mom about to accost me, as she does the same thing. Donald. What does Mom want this time? Donald. I want to edge now. Give me the whacker. Me. That's a hard no. I'm not done, and you have to wait for me to finish. Donald. But I don't want to wait. I want to edge now. It takes no time, you'd be back at your yard before Mom notices you taking a break. Me. That's a lie, and you know it. Mom's probably on her way right now to make sure you watered her plants. Donald. Getting angry, I'm not rolling over for him despite being older than him by 1.5 years, and begins stalking towards me with the damaged end of the cord. I'm edging now. I'm tired of having to sit on the porch for you to finish. Me. Should have thought about that when you decided to be a lazy, worthless pig and get Mom to change the rules for you. If it ain't a rule, you can kiss my arse. Donald's face turned red, and he lifted the cord like it was a flail. I noticed the plug at the end was bent at an odd angle, with what looked like copper hairs sticking out in different directions. I'm sure that my brother would have swung that cord at me to get his way. He has aggression issues, and when mad he resorts to violence instead of trying to have an adult conversation. I screamed for Mom, and let me tell you, she was less than pleased that Donald had ruined the plug. It was half ripped off, and the incident spawned a new rule that I insisted applied to Mom as well in vain. I lost my phone and computer privilege for a week for calling Donald a pig. He lost his gaming privilege for 3 days for ruining the extension cord, which Dad had to buy a new plug for and attach. In the early 2000s, we moved out of military housing and began to rent a place in another part of town. Not long after Dad got his contractor job, so we could afford the cost of living in the area, and Mom chased down any sort of discount she could to make things more affordable, and us doing our own yard work was one of those things. The new house wasn't on a cul-de-sac, which I was thankful for. At some point, the homeowner had turned the original back patio into an extra room and turned some of the backyard into a new patio prior to us moving in. The backyard was smaller than the front yard, but I was so stuck in the habit of the backyard that I didn't even question its size. When Donald figured this out, he threw a man-child fit to Mom, who demanded to know why I hadn't bothered to offer to Donald to swap yards so he could have the smaller yard some of the time. Hadn't occurred to me since we hadn't swapped yards in years. Just as before, every time we were supposed to swap yards, Donald would throw his man-child fit, and it ended up just like it had as children, with him permanently having the smaller yard, which only took 30 minutes, while I had the larger yard, which only took 40 minutes. By this time, we'd upgraded to a new electronic mower, so the frustrations of the gas can were gone, but the battle for the clipping bag remained. I didn't care much. It was a chore that needed doing, and I had given up this battle a long time ago. That was until one summer, there was a beehive or wasp nest growing under the awning in the backyard. Donald spotted it and decided that on that day, he'd graciously swap yards with me, which I found immediately suspicious, so I told him to heck off and went about my work in the front yard. No less than 3 minutes later, Mom was out digging her talons into my arm and berating me for being so selfish that I didn't want to take my brother up on his offer to swap yards after having made such a stink about not being able to do so. We hadn't actually fought about it for 5 years, so I don't know where she got this, unless she was projecting Donald's man-child tantrums onto me. Just wanting her to stop trying to leave a permanent impression of her fingertips in my elbow, I relented and got to work with a few more insects buzzing about my head than I was used to but thought nothing of it. That was until Dad came out to check the grill and spotted me right under the budding insect nest. I never got stung, but being dragged away from the mower by my now retired father and into the house, all while he was hollering to call property management to get pest control over, immediately freaked me out. Mom paled when she saw the size of the nest, but didn't apologize for putting me at risk because of Donald's behavior. Nor did Donald apologize even after admitting he'd seen the nest before deciding he wanted to swap yards. He had only wanted not to have to mow over there and hadn't thought it was that big a deal to make his older sister do it for him and not mention the nest to anyone else. We were all furious at him, and for the first time in forever, Mom enforced the swapping of the lawns. After the exterminators had come to take care of the problem, of course. After I moved out, I was only so happy to never have to touch a mower again, and admitted to Dad that I would be happy to know how much trouble Donald got himself now that he had no one else to blame for his problems when doing the lawn. Turns out that despite us doing the lawn, which got Mom and Dad a reduction in rent, because property management didn't have to arrange for landscapers, Donald was spared any and all yard work instead of having to man up. It hurt realizing that despite being at risk for who knows how many stings, years worth of risk of blindness due to mishandling of gasoline, money lost replacing sprinklers, and the invisible fence that was bought to keep the dog in the yard, and the emotional and mental trauma of being treated like a lesser person compared to my entitled lazy brother, that Donald wasn't ever held accountable the way I was, that it was easier to pay full rent cost instead of making the only stay-at-home offspring use the new mower to retain the discount. I wasn't really surprised, just disappointed and hurt. Donald always got his way, and I'm glad I don't have to deal with this kind of thing anymore. Update. My entitled mother gets aggressive with wheelchairs. Seems there's a pattern here of my stories about my mother being in two parts. Thankfully, the gap here is only a year instead of decades in middle school. Also, I was 17 at the time. This happened with the second incident happening at 18. This started when a Ford F-150 owned by a company that worked both sides of the border, but was only insured in Mexico, ran a red light by my high school without slowing down at over 40 mph and continued at speed alongside the elementary school across the street. That was until they came to my intersection, where they realized there was a problem, and they hit the brakes. It was lucky that the driver threaded the needle between the second and third car during the protected turn part of the intersection cycle and only hit me. I could have been under 3 cars worth of twisted metal instead of having taken an involuntary 15-foot flying lesson without a glider, followed immediately by bodyboarding without a board on pavement for another 20 or so feet. As bad as it was, I got off easy. My leg was broken straight across the femur at the height of the bumper, and my 2 front teeth were shattered to the roots, with one of the neighboring teeth having been chipped and some lost skin here and there. I was confined to a wheelchair for a long time, and it hurt to move around, so Mom, who is very controlling, narcissistic, and entitled, halted all her volunteer work to take care of a now even more disabled daughter. This happened 20 years ago, so there's a lot of fuzzy details. But I do remember during one of the regular checkups, the doctor said I could resume some normal activities and leave the house, to which I'd said I wanted to go back to school, even if for only 1 class. I missed my friends and wanted to get out and socialize. I was figuratively climbing up the walls due to my inability to escape my mom forcing me to watch any TV show she wanted and sitcoms featuring her new agenda after my nana accused her of not caring for me during the divorce. I suffered through weeks nonstop of men dumping the women they knocked up, teen moms being entitled and expecting their parents and grandparents to support them while they raised the baby, stories of women being taken advantage of, Dateline, you name it. A campaign of men are evil and only want sex, and women are helpless against them. Unable to escape, too young to know what I'm talking about, and drawing a lot of attention. I just wanted my life back and spend time with my friends, so I counted the days between doctor's visits and was as good a patient as I could be to try and keep my healing on track. The doctor said I could for a few hours, and I picked my favorite class, a P biology, which is where I learned my blood type. Problem is, going to school in a wheelchair was a new challenge, and Mom had to push me since I didn't have the arm strength to make the quarter to half-mile trek by myself at times. And that's when I noticed the problem. Well, the beginning of it got worse as time went on, as things are wanted to do with any EM. It was strange going by the intersection where the accident happened, but crossing a little 2-lane residential street was no problem. The problem was the 4-lane T intersection that ran in front of my high school, which had an additional turning lane. The road was badly paved and drivers still didn't honor the light, as this was relatively new. Mom ran me across, and until we got over the hump in the middle of the street, it was fine. Once we were going downhill, she kept up the pace, and I felt like I was going to be thrown out of the chair. I was also a bit amazed. She could still run with how much pain she claimed to be in because of her foot. I clung to the wheelchair like my life depended on it, but said nothing. She never listened anyway. I didn't want to be denied any chance of escaping her for a few hours by seeming ungrateful about receiving help. The next day was just as hair-raising, and I held my breath as I clung to metal and plastic. On the third day, I asked Mom to please not go so fast because it made me feel unsafe. On the fourth day, I nearly lost my new glasses if it weren't for the little neck strap that lets them hang from your neck. This time, I told her not to go so fast since being polite and explaining why I'm asking clearly isn't good enough. The drivers here have no respect for anyone or anything. If you're going to get to your class, we need to cross quickly, so until you can push yourself about, you're going to have to accept it. Don't want you back in the hospital again now, do we? This goes on for a week, while I struggle around the house to build up strength, and on the second week of my return to class a few things happened. I had been gaining strength and had some mobility around the house. I wanted to get my independence back from Mom, who delighted in toddling me around whenever she went, while Dad was at work on base doing whatever you do when enlisted. I was tired of the dread whenever we were out and crossing any street. I was afraid of what she might do if she got frustrated at others, with me essentially confined to a sitting position and completely dependent on her. Before I regained independent mobility, things escalated a bit. A jacket I kept in my lap got bounced into the crosswalk due to being run across the street, and several cars ran it over before the lights turned, so she could fetch it, which she only did under great protest. Had to throw the hoodie out, but she used it as proof that she had every right to make me feel unsafe just to cross a street. Another time, my injured leg, which was in a brace, got jostled out of its support, and I slammed the brake for one wheel so I could put my leg back in place. I got admonished for using my brakes while crossing a street and not being more careful with my hurt leg. We were running across trolley tracks, so I'm still not sure what I could have done differently in the situation. I had enough, and the day after, I waited for Mom to run me across the street without any regard for how unsafe her method made me feel. As we passed over the high point of the street, I put my hands on the brake levers and lightly applied them to scrape against the wheels without forcing a full stop, so that Mom would have to slow down after asking once again her not to go so fast. Not after everything that had already happened these last weeks that made me feel uncomfortable and unsafe. Stop that. She didn't slow down and went faster in the short time I'd eased up, so I applied the brakes again to enforce a speed I felt safer with. I felt her hit the back of my head and the chair, and we crossed that day no later than usual, and without unnecessary pain on my part. Can't say the same for her. She was delaying a necessary surgery because she'd have to be driven around by friends for no less than 3 months. But that's a tale for another time. This repeats for 3 more days before she's had enough of me enforcing my desire not to be thrown from the wheelchair with the use of tactical brakes. Abrasis, you don't seem to be taking this situation seriously and think you have every right to use those brakes. You're getting yourself to school from here on without any help. She huffed and puffed and played the poor suffering mother with a bad foot with an ungrateful daughter on the phone that day to her few remaining friends after her first round of address book purge. I was expecting this. Whenever someone challenged her or asked her not to do a thing for any reason, she threw this fit and retracted any old benefit the recipient got from the arrangement. She had refused to let me try to push myself at all between home and school, so the only way I was going to get the chance was to frustrate her to the point she allowed me to prove that I could. It was hard pushing myself, but every time she started to act sweet about how hard it must be to push myself, and that it would be faster if I let her help, I found I had a little more strength. I got blisters and calluses. My arms felt like limp noodles and ached in that good way of building muscle strength, and I got to class late for a while. She followed me though, so she did care in that strange manner of horrible parents who love nothing more than to give their kids lifelong trauma that requires thousands of dollars of therapy, just in case. No driver ran me over, but after the hump of the street by my school, I felt my chair dip as I coasted to the sidewalk. Mom had put her feet on the back bar of the chair and was holding onto the handlebars so she didn't have to walk the distance herself, all while she smiled and waved to the drivers. She took to doing this every day, and I learned how to turn corners using the brakes, so the increased speed from added weight didn't faze me much. But it was another case of not knowing how to react. I'd like to say incidents that casually scared me only happened near the house, but she did it at a wholesale store. At an amusement park, this involved a whole other mess, where it was stolen, but Reddit's filter doesn't seem to like the tale. It was worse in crowded places like the amusement park, the beach, a theater, or the grocery store on a Sunday. As soon as I was in that weird middle ground of being able to use crutches to get around, but still needing a wheelchair for long distances, she started to change what she was doing with me in public. My healing had progressed to where I'd regained range of motion in my knee, so my leg wasn't stuck in front of me like a sore thumb. Both could rest comfortably in a sitting position, which initially I was pretty happy about. I thought the first few times it was an accident, but when Mom was in control, I was running into people's calves more often, making people yelp and turn to see what hit them. I was being pushed and shoved through crowds like it was the Fast and Furious franchise. I was a means to an end, a way to cut lines and make people move since Mom's foot was messed up. I resented every moment she was behind me in a wheelchair, because I got the dirty looks, not her even though she was pushing. Once I had graduated to only needing a cane to get around, I swore I wouldn't let anyone else I know ever experience Mom in control of their wheelchair, if it ever happened. A year later, my family was going to an amusement park, the one with the dancing old guy commercial, and I'd invited my bestie Bubbles, who I regret had to have a part in this tale. While at this park, she twisted her ankle and Mom, Dad, and I were in agreement to take her back home, a 4-hour drive with traffic. Bubbles insisted she had only twisted her ankle and didn't want to leave as the trip was planned out for a long weekend, and she got hurt on the last day. We had to rent a park wheelchair, and I felt the old dread waking from its slumber. I'll admit I kinda hovered out of concern for her and out of fear for what Mom might do. I didn't care if I had to use a cane for myself. I had a mission. I did my very best to make sure I was the one to push Bubbles around, and if not me, then only to let Mom do it on flat stretches of the park where her aggression would not be triggered. The only snag was one of those round boat rides that hold 12 people per boat, as the ride was barely wheelchair accessible, and we both wanted to give it a go. As we got to the end of the day, the crowds of people leaving were thicker than pea soup, and I was hanging onto the handlebars of the rented wheelchair with a white-knuckled grip. Bubbles was tired and in moderate pain, but progress was slow. Mom was limping with her hurt foot, and I had a sinking feeling that something was about to happen. Something about the look on Mom's face put me on edge. "Move over, Abraxas, you're too slow." I got an elbow in the ribs, yanked Bubbles around as Mom pried my hands free of the handlebars, and I had the happy bonus of my entitled brother Donald telling me not to push. I could only watch as Mom shoved the wheelchair forward into the calves and ankles of the people in front of us, and all she got was some dirty looks and people trying to get out of her way because those footrests hurt a hecton if you don't get the right footwear. Bubbles turned in the chair, and there I was beside her. Another turn, and he sees who's in control of her fate. We're trapped in a packed crowd with a wheelchair pushed by an aggressive Karen. Mom was in control of where and how fast Bubbles went. I couldn't tell who felt worse, her or me. Bubbles looked scared, and I was miserable because I was incapable of helping her. I knew what Mom was capable of, but I still wasn't prepared. By now we had a gap in front of us thanks to the aggressive wheelchair handling, and a young kid stepped into that empty area while holding onto a parent's hand. Mom didn't like this and leaned over Bubbles, as she had in the past with me, and shoved the child into their parents' legs, while thrusting forward several feet to keep the kid from doing that again. To me, it looked like Mom backhanded this kid, but Bubbles insists it was just a rough shove. I told her over the phone about the unfair punishments, the lies, narcissism, and entitlement. It must have sounded like your usual teen garbage about hating your parents, but there it was, unashamed physical violence towards kids and a disregard for those around her. I think I tried to get control of the wheelchair back, but Mom was resolute in treating the wheelchair and its occupant like a battering ram to get herself off her feet and to the car faster. Bubbles and I were both appalled, but could only suffer through the bad behavior, dirty looks, curses until we were at the rental office to wait and return the wheelchair. Without it, Bubbles couldn't walk all the way to the car, and I insisted that I sit alone with her while the rest of the family helped Mom. It was a cold night outside the front gate with a park employee nearby to take the rental back inside the gate to prevent theft. "I'm sorry, Bubbles. Really, I knew Mom would have done something like that, but she never hit anyone else's kids. She did that kind of thing before when I was in a wheelchair for a time. It's why I tried so hard to be there for you and push you around. I didn't want you to feel unsafe or scared just because you have to be in a wheelchair with your ankle swollen like that." She stayed silent. I was impotently mad at Mom for not having the sense to restrain herself for one holiday weekend out of a year in front of my longtime best friend. 4 days out of the year to behave like the perfect parent, she pretended to be in public the same as she had for the hours I attended events at the Blind Rec Center. I didn't care if Mom was in pain because of her own stupid decisions. She was an adult and knew better, as she put it. But even I knew better than to do anything that she'd done in the last half hour. TLDR. M uses people in wheelchairs as siege engines to get wherever she wants to go. Edit. Grammar and typos. Update. Can you spot Karen? Wheelchair woes at an amusement park. D. Let's see if this tickles the refined palates of all you fabulous readers. Coffee points if you can spot the entitled peoples. Also, I did my best to pick the sub this fits in. If there's a better match, please let me know, because it's a little all over the place with entitlement. Or cast. Mom quite entitled, but maybe a justifiably irate and concerned mother this time. Dad cool enlisted dad. Donald little brother. Me permanently visually disabled and temporarily physically disabled. Bubbles permanently visually disabled in a different way and temporarily physically disabled. Operator a little thanked him who I had 2 separate run-ins with. PR a much abused public relations representative. For some context, I spent a short while in a wheelchair after a car accident a month before my birthday, and my parents had originally planned to go to an amusement park for my birthday. This got postponed until I was cleared by the doctor for the kind of strain roller coasters can put on joints and healing bones, and I pushed myself to regain the minimum required range of motion in my affected knee, because we only went to this amusement park once, maybe twice a year. We had rented a wheelchair from the military hospital for the duration of my physical therapy, and it folded up pretty nicely. But we still had to take both cars so we could bring our cooler of pre-made food and drinks and my wheelchair for the trip. It was early summer, and this was the summer where one of the water rides was reopened after a remodel. There had been an accident in a ride like it elsewhere in the country that had killed or maimed all the riders, and we really liked that one over the long ride. We all wanted to give it a go. I had my crutches, but I wasn't that great with them yet, so I was pushed around the park by Mom or Dad, but never my brother. I didn't trust him even when he was close enough to punch on a regular basis, but we were civil under Mom's watchful gaze. We quickly learned where all the wheelchair-accessible entrances were, found out they had some lockers behind the ride operators' stands where canes, crutches, and walkers could be parked and watched to prevent theft. My wheelchair was shiny silver with black plastic, and was sized for me, which was good since it looked strikingly different from the park's rentals, so even if you were colorblind, the width and logos would be a dead giveaway. The rentals were matte gray with navy plastic, and the park's logo emblazoned on the back and in the seat. These rentals were also very wide to accommodate many different body styles, so even someone who can't tell the difference in color, and somehow can't see the gaudy park logo, might see that my chair wasn't XXL. Even with my mobility, there were some rides that were no-goes, which included one of my favorites, a suspended steel roller coaster, and one of the oldest rides which doubled back upon itself and occupied a really small space. The second one was really well known, but it was retired and deconstructed in recent years. One of the new ones I'd been looking forward to for a year was also suspended, but didn't support your feet, so I wasn't allowed to ride it because the forces applied by it might re-break my leg. Before lunch, we went to the reopened water ride, the kind with a big round boat that sat 12 people at a time, and the line for it was thankfully short. My brother was sent through the front entrance of the ride to see if the wheelchair entrance was there, and 10 minutes later, he came back saying he found nothing, so we figured this meant that the exit was the intended wheelchair access. The whole thing had been repoured during the remodel, and so we went on up none the wiser to the unpleasantness we were walking into. We ran into an obstacle when a turnstile and trash can block the way, both chained together and chained to the hand railings on either side, so there was no moving them aside to let the wheelchair through. Donald was sent ahead and reported back that there were 3 more obstacles like this, and my parents decided instead of trying to have me hobble my way on crutches through the turnstile, so that Dad could pass the wheelchair over the trash can all the way up the ramp, we would have to compete with riders leaving, and my chair would block a third of the walkway as we waited for them to pass. I didn't like it, but we left my wheelchair at the bottom of the ramp behind the trash can at the bottom, so it was out of sight while I hobbled up the ramp and had to navigate the 4 obstacles with varying degrees of success, and I nearly ate concrete one time. That hassle over, we now had to wait for a ride attendant to clear us to ride. One fun, wet ride later, and I'm hobbling down the ramp and looking forward to lunch. Except that something was horribly wrong. My wheelchair was gone. I was beside myself, and trying not to cry as Mom stomped off to the gift shops across the way to Karen it up and demanded to see any potential footage of the theft, while Dad tried to see if it had maybe rolled down the hill towards the next section of the park. When Mom returned, she said that a clerk had seen some guy and his girlfriend walk up the exit ramp to grab my chair and ride it down the hill. Mom said it must be some Mexicans like the clerk. You don't say some person if they're not from the same area as you. That comment horrified me, but wasn't that out of character for Mom? And when Dad returned, she sent him the other direction to see if they left the chair at the bottom, while she stomped off to harass a park worker about the situation. Hours later, we were back at the ride, and this time we're super determined to get my wheelchair up the ramp with me to prevent another round with people borrowing it. And it was every bit as obnoxious as we had feared. The rule for this ride is that any person who used the disabled entrance had to wait for a time equal to the line in front to keep things fair, and we were okay with this. After waiting twice the time required, we raised our concerns with the operator, and the conversation went something like this. Dad, excuse me, but we've been waiting for about an hour, and my son says the front of the ride only has a 30-minute wait. When are you going to let my family board the boat? Operator. It's a ride policy that disabled riders have to wait for the duration of the front line. Dad. This isn't the first time we've ridden this ride today, and the front line is only 30 minutes, and we've waited twice this time. Operator. Well, they looked over and saw me in my wheelchair. We can't let your daughter ride without a rental receipt. You might have stolen the wheelchair from someone else and been trying to cut in line. Dad blinked, because this was the first we heard of needing a rental receipt, which we didn't even have because it was a personal wheelchair and not a park rental. Dad. We don't have a receipt. This is a personal chair, and it looks nothing like park rentals. Operator. No receipt, no ride. Get out of here, your family is obstructing the exit. I bet she's not even disabled. I would almost feel bad for the ire this operator had summoned from my mom, who had already scared up a public relations rep when my chair was stolen, so she wasted no time getting the same poor woman to abandon her air-conditioned office to come to our location. PR. What seems to be the problem here? Operator, this family is trying to get priority placement without a rental receipt for a wheelchair they stole from another patron and are upset about it. Mom, are you blind or just stupid? Look at the wheelchair my daughters are sitting in, say Dad. It's not the same color as the rentals, and it has the Navy Hospital's emblem on the back instead of the amusement parks. My husband is in the Navy and has his ID. We all have military IDs, and we will not be treated this way. Mom went off for a bit longer, and PR looked at me. I recognized her from before when she tried to calm me down after my chair had been stolen, and I saw something click now that she realized that the same patrons had two different issues at the same ride, relating to the same disabled family member. A public relations nightmare in the making. PR. I can see how this can be upsetting, and it won't be necessary to look at your IDs. I can discuss this incident with the operator while you take your ride, and afterward we can discuss further how to. Mom. No, you will not hush us up to get on a ride just so you can slink away and try to hide not one, but two incidents of discrimination. 3. Since this ride isn't wheelchair accessible. And don't you say it's because this is one of the original water rides in the park. The Bobcat is just as old, and we all saw how great a job management got it up to code with an elevator. Not wanting to be a part of this, the rest of the family leapt into the boat for a wild, wet ride, and upon returning, Mom was still yapping at the PR, who had their best customer service smile, but it looked a bit worn. Mom looked at this poor lady pointedly as we went down the ramp and told PR to watch this. Dad, Donald, and I maneuvered the first hurdle with me getting out of the chair while Donald went through the turnstile. Dad folded my chair and passed it over the trash can, and me with my crutches hobbled through the turnstile awkwardly, while Donald fumbled to unfold the chair, and we went 20 to 30 feet to the next hurdle to do that all over again. There was a total of 4 of these hurdles, the same distance from each other. And when we got to the bottom, Mom was ranting about how non-wheelchair accessible this ride was, as someone in a power wheelchair would be denied access because of the hurdles. We got a meal compiled by PR and placating promises to have the accessibility of the ride looked into, and to ensure all staff at the rides received proper training, as the poor woman escaped. My family was going back to that amusement park for their Halloween celebrations, and my best friend Bubbles came with us. As mentioned in my other story, she twisted her ankle, and we had to get a park rental. Dad and I remember the spat with that one operator, and we keep ludicrous attention on that little badly printed rental receipt and put it in a Ziploc baggie with our wallets so that the ink couldn't be smudged and rendered illegible. Up until the boat ride, there was no issue with any ride whatsoever using a park rental, except a few times when some entitled patrons tried to run off with it while we were in the middle of the one ride or another, but the various ride operators were on top of the situation, and nothing bad ever happened. We even saw one entitled couple being escorted out of the ride, while an operator brought the wheelchair back. I got the receipt from Dad and Bubbles, and I went up the exit ramp of the boat ride after checking on the wait, which was barely even 5 minutes. The turnstiles were still in place, chained to the trash cans, and both were chained to the handrails. The only difference was the rust stains that ran down the pavement because of the rainy season. Bubbles was confused but hobbled through the turnstiles, while I manhandled the rental up and over the trash cans for her. We get to the top, and I notice it's the same operator I had a problem with last time, and I hope there won't be an issue since we have our rental receipt. And I tried to show it to her right away, but was waved off to wait. We waited for 45 minutes with the two of us chatting, and many patrons had gone around a few times to ride before I walked up to the operator. Me, excuse me. We've been waiting for nearly an hour to ride, and the wait is only a few minutes long. Operator, and what do you want? Me, to ride. My friend's in a rental wheelchair, and I have the receipt. I produce the receipt in the baggie, and the grumpy woman barely looks at the slip of paper with its fading ink. Operator, that doesn't look real. Can't even read it. You might have gotten that from the trash, or from a friend, a few days ago. Not valid. I doubt she's even disabled. I pulled the receipt free and pointed at the time and date stamp that even my half-blind eyes could read. This made it clear that this was printed today and was from the rental office, and not any of the gift shops. When I'm mad, I don't yell. I get quiet. I'd learned over the course of my own time in a wheelchair that I can control blinking, and that not blinking makes people uncomfortable, so I got in her personal space by leaning on the railing between the operator's booth and the rest of the walkway while I held my eyes very open as I essentially growled at her. Me. It is valid, and I don't care for your attitude. You did this to me months ago when I was in a personal wheelchair, and while I don't know how you aren't fired now, I'm going to make you a promise. You let us on right now as I have a valid receipt for the rental chair, and we've waited nearly an hour to ride a ride with only a 5-minute long line. Or, I glare daggers into this woman's beady pig-like eyes, while my own eyes are begging for me to blink. I can have her wobble around, break her ankle worse than it is, and fall over so we can sue you for gross negligence, child endangerment, and discrimination. I wonder how PR will like you after that. Operator. There's no need for that. The receipt's valid so you can. Me, too late. My mom loves to call on PR at any public place that mistreats me, and I can see Dad coming up the ramp right now. Such a shame I have to tell him that we weren't allowed to ride, because 2 half-blind minors, one of whom is unable to walk and got hurt within the park, aren't disabled enough for you. I had to blink, and it felt great. Operator. No, wait, that's not what. Dad. Bubbles, Abraxas, what's taking so long? You're making the rest of us worry. You were only supposed to ride once. He spots the operator, who must have seen a ray of salvation at the thought of saving her own hide, and throws us under a bus. He, however, made a face like he'd stepped in a fresh pile of dog crap. I quickly pounce on Dad and point at a camera as I talk over the operator, show him the receipt and smile gleefully as he, with his military buzz cut, and takes no BS attitude, proceeded to oversee her letting us onto the ride with a rigid military stance minus uniform. When the two of us come back, soaking wet and happy, I see a small crowd waiting for us. Mom, Dad, operator, a guy in the standard park uniform, Donald, and PR. I watched as PR smiled at my parents and promised to handle this personally as I got Bubbles back in the rental. We got another meal comped by the park, and the young man took over for the previous ride operator who walked down the ramp with PR. Dad got in front of the pair and helped me get the wheelchair down the ramp, which was every bit as awkward as it was the first time, and Mom delighted in promising to report the park for non-compliance of mandated accessibility requirements, as this ride still wouldn't allow any powered wheelchairs, and even rentals couldn't be maneuvered past the obstacles without the rider being displaced and put at risk of further physical harm. I never saw that operator at that ride, or anywhere in the park again, but I know that many employees quit between seasons and both incidents occurred during the same season. I like to think that the woman got fired that day, and that the young man got promoted to operator from something like sanitation, but maybe that's wishful thinking. What I do know is next season they had removed all the turnstiles on the exit ramp, so that wheelchair occupations could go all the way up without being made to walk. Edit. Thank you, kind person, for the award. Update. My EM gets offended that an artist dares to sell my dad art. Sorry for the dry spell of tales about my crazy entitled mom. This one took me a while to get from Dad and occurred after he retired from the Navy. I believe around 2012. Their marriage was more rocky than I'd seen before. Mom always loved to complain about things and paraded herself as the one of higher moral fiber because she preferred discussion to arguments, which I felt was rich since all she did at home was argue with Dad and try to pit me against Dad by pointing out flaws, which were just coping mechanisms for dealing with her. Years before we'd met an artist we'll call Ella at a local art show, our relationship with them started with my brother Donald being quite taken with a piece of art in a way he'd never taken to art before. The petite woman worked with mosaic glass, and every piece was guaranteed to be unique, handmade, and stunning because of it. Mom hadn't wanted to spend over $100 on something my brother may not appreciate for more than 15 minutes. but said we could come back later if he still wanted it. Near the end of the show we did return, and the piece had sold, which saddened Donald visibly, and he moped the rest of the day, unbeknownst to me. Mom and Dad had been contacted by the artist, who offered something similar made from the same types of glass with similar elements to those he kept touching in the piece that had sold. Donald loves his piece, still touches, dust, and smiles about it. The reason for this one, and only duplicate, was that Ella had never seen a young man so taken with her work before, and she wanted to make sure that a good relationship with art could be nurtured. We got a piece every other art show we saw Ella at around the state we Ella her at, and she was quite pleased to say soon we could visit her gallery, as she was planning to set up a permanent space in a community that was known for its artists and the thriving community of locals and tourists who came to get unique pieces. She also happily told us she was setting up an online store where she planned to sell her pieces to reach a wider audience, and this is what would eventually cause Mom to go full-on Karen later. Dad had just survived a company merger and kept his job under a new boss, but with a bigger office, so he thought about what he'd want to put where and remembered Ella's work and her online store. Of all of us, Dad had nothing of his own, and he browsed the store for a while to pick something the size of a standard store-bought canvas. He listed his office address instead of the home address for the delivery address and thought that was it. He got an invoice for his purchase and was told that he'd be provided a tracking number as soon as the product was shipped. This would have been the end of the story if it weren't for one tiny thing. The website Ella used suffered some sort of failure, and she lost the receiving addresses, but was able to regain the names of who bought what, if they were a repeat customer who'd had things mailed before, and some email addresses. So the piece Dad bought was packaged and shipped to the house, followed by an email to Mom about the piece and its tracking number. Mom lost her unholy crap and accosted Dad the moment he got home about trying to hide things from her. There was a lot of yelling, and Dad tried to explain that it wasn't for a lady friend or a coworker. It was for him and his new office. Mom insisted it wasn't for that and said she was going to return the piece the moment it came in. Dad had to email Ella to see what went wrong with the mailing address and to get the tracking number since Mom was refusing to give it over willingly. This is where I thought the story stopped as I moved out shortly afterward. But apparently Dad had to call out the day the piece was to arrive to prevent Mom from making good on her threat or worse. Apparently, the fact that Dad was buying custom art for an office space Mom would never get to see, which meant the items were also beyond her power to use for leverage or destroy. If she got mad enough, was truly unpalatable. She packed her butt into her Subaru and drove the better part of several hours in rush hour traffic out of town to Ella's new gallery. Sadly, this day Ella was in, and Mom confronted a woman smaller than herself for daring to sell her work to a paying customer, aka Dad. I know my mom. She loves to get into people's faces, and her southern drawl comes out, and Ella is a prim proper lady with a European accent who, due to some kind of trauma in her past, had a larger personal space bubble than normal. I am confident to say Mom likely got in Ella's face and was practically yelling as she towered over the artist, while Ella sidestepped to try and maintain the personal safe space she preferred. The gallery co-owner, Ella's friend, was apparently called in and had to call security to escort Mom out, and was informed she was banned from returning. Ever since, Mom has had nothing nice to say about Ella, who she used to get along with swimmingly, and has gone out of her way to cut Ella out of her friend's circle. Dad has since gotten a few more pieces also kept in his office and maintained a friendly relationship with Ella, who at one point considered a restraining order against Mom. Ella felt terrible for mailing to the wrong address and explained to Dad about the lost data, which he understood. I, however, feel awful for Ella, as I never knew the full extent of the story before this. Especially knowing that Mom, after much badgering, had convinced Ella to sell her first piece of mosaic glass art. Ella and her dad, who passed away years after the piece was done, had worked together to create a huge, unique piece that was Ella's connection to the best part of her childhood. Ella had wished Dad had won it in the divorce, as she felt he deserved it. But Dad, being the bigger man, let Mom have it. Update. Pettiness on Christmas Day 2015 EM refuses thoughtful present. Here we are, back again with another tale about my mom pre-divorce. This occurred in 2015. They say it's hard to buy presents for your parents as a teenager, and specifically for your father. And it's true, we generally have a hard time knowing what our parents would like that we could afford. Add some entitlement to the mix, and you better not only know what they want, be able to get it, and do it all while having your life managed and snooped on by said ep, which ruins the experience. When I was too small to be able to get anything myself, Dad used to help me out by pointing out things that might be appreciated. As I grew up, I tried to figure this out myself, and found out what a minefield it was without his guidance. One year, when I thought getting her an aromatic mulled wine, her favorite scent at the time, candle from Illuminations, was received with lukewarm apathy as a thoughtless gift for Christmas. I then tried a gift card that could be used almost anywhere for her next birthday. You'd think I insulted her personally with a gift card, so that was a never again experience. Through high school and into adulthood, I watched her purchases like a hawk, trying to predict a need that might pass for a gift at the appropriate times of the year and pray to the heartless gods of narcissism that she didn't get it herself before then. With ADHD, this was mentally and physically exhausting and served as a source to my anxiety and depression. Every gifting holiday was nothing but anxiety for me as I prayed she'd mean it when she said she liked something, that she actually meant it this time, and I wouldn't see it in the trash weeks later, or on my dresser for unknown reasons. Throughout the years, Mom maintained that she would be fine with any kind of gift. But I knew better, as when I discovered she threw out a gift that she claimed to like, Mom made up an excuse of it being tacky, or low quality, or some other dribble as to why 2 weeks later she didn't want it. Sometimes it was over things as petty as not agreeing with her during a conversation when my opinion differs. So one Christmas, we were at a month-long festival in December, and Mom had been searching for a year to have Larmer earrings that matched a necklace she got at a jewelry roadshow, and she had no luck. At this public event, I saw a lapidary booth that actually had earrings, in a style I knew Mom would like, and with the same stone and a matching necklace that closed magnetically. I was pleased and got both, thinking Mom might like a necklace whose clasp wouldn't grab the hair on the back of her neck and pull. On Christmas Eve, Mom seemed pleased with the earrings and dispassionate about the necklace, though she put both on. But she was much happier with the coral and turquoise necklace that my brother Donald got her, that I know he didn't pay for or pick, since Mom or Dad always had to hurt him towards buying anything that wasn't food or video games. We ended the night watching some movie I mostly forget, except for the part that Mom tried to encourage discussion on. The protagonist was a woman who survived childhood trauma, as you find out nearly at the end of the movie, and suddenly, as a successful businesswoman, her parents were coming back and began saying that the woman owed them money. Halfway through, Mom insisted the protagonist was an awful person who never supported her mother in anything and clearly had behavior issues connecting to others and deserved to have legal action taken against her. As per her usual with real or perceived mental issues people had, Mom insisted that the protagonist needed to take pills and get over herself. This transitioned into a quick rant about Dad, which I ignored in favor of watching a movie I had no desire to see, as it put me entirely too close to Mom. And she always tried to instigate debates about the movie while watching so that you couldn't actually enjoy it. This is where the revelation about childhood trauma came in, and I responded to Mom, pointing out that the protagonist didn't deserve to be crapped on by her parents, as they clearly didn't care if they nearly killed the female lead multiple times as she grew up, and that all they wanted was money and to continue mistreating her as an adult. Mom tried to get Donald involved, who said rudely that he didn't care, and he didn't even want to see this movie, but was so that Mom wouldn't cut off his internet for the night. His words exactly. Spoiler, he got his wish. Only my room and internet cut. I was happy when the movie was over and went to bed, while my brother threw down in some online game, which I heard through our shared bedroom wall. Next morning, I'm startled awake as Mom threw my bedroom door open, and it rebounded off the wall. I was dazed and confused as I heard something being thrown onto my dresser and Mom snarling that she didn't want it. To be honest, I just went back to sleep as she burst in at 5 in the morning. Another booming thump in the house, and Mom drives off. She did this every single time someone disagreed with her and refused to be the loser. Dad came to check on me, and I managed to wake up enough to hold a small conversation. Dad, that's the jewelry you got your mom? Me, is it? I sat up in bed to try and see jewelry on the dresser, next to my pile of gifts from the day before. Dad, yeah. He picked up the $90 pile of jewelry so I could see it better. Me, huh? I'm in my sleep-deprived state. I did a fair impression of the iconic Minecraft villager. Least she didn't throw it out this time. That wasn't cheap. Dad set it down again and hadn't come in any farther than the bedroom door, and there was an awkward silence. The house was quiet, and the dog wandered in to leap onto the bed for cuddles. He took a breath and asked if he could come in. Of my parents, he's the only one that respected my only personal space in the house. Turns out Mom had stewed on the fact that I disagreed with her about the female lead in last night's movie deserving all the horrible things that happened until the revelation. That somehow the victim of childhood trauma, who was being stalked by her elderly parents for not being a doormat, deserved what she got for being a rotten child and teenager, according to Mom's narrative. I told Dad that I pointed out that the parents were awful, and the lead well deserved to have her parents serve their time in the justice system for their crimes against children. Dad was aware of what the movie was about, and was surprised Mom had picked it given that she had childhood trauma of a different kind. So this movie probably triggered her, but that it still wasn't all right for her to return my gift over a disagreement. On that day, I refused to get my mom anything over $10 because I put some real thought into this gift. I wanted it to be something she treasured the way she treasured my brother's gifts. She had chosen to watch a movie that was bad for her with the half-baked notion that I would miraculously and blindly agree with her that parents are always right and get to do whatever they want. We hit the scene that flips the entire narrative to that point, and she gets triggered, and I point out that in fact parents aren't right, and in cases like this, the pushback is deserved. Being petty was more important to her than admitting she was wrong. It's been years, and I still have that necklace and earrings. I keep them as a reminder to never spend extravagantly on that woman. The necklace is chunky and not my style, but I've taken to wearing the earrings. Edit. Sorry, I can't remember what the movie was called other than the actress was talented and modestly pretty, and I hated the whole thing because my mom was trying to push her agenda during it. Update. My little brother is an entitled golden child part 1. Some of what will be mentioned may be triggering to some people, for which I'm sorry. I didn't like it much either when I grew up living it. I escaped this crap show in 2013 and Donald is still living at home with Mom, where he belongs. It's a life he's always chosen, and I don't enjoy the thought of having to visit them. TLDR. You know your little brother is an entitled brat person when you can break down every part of your life and smell the hot stink of their booty crack on everything. Edit. Oh my god, I'm sorry. I must have hit my laptop screen when I closed it for lunch and posted the whole thing without the chippy choppy I was planning. Edit 2. There will be a part 2. If you've seen my other stories, you may have heard me refer to my 18 months younger little brother Donald as entitled without really bringing up anything to support it outside a few incidents that could be waved aside as pure sibling rivalry, which I can say is not true having life with him for 27 years of my life and been abused and bullied him for as long as I can remember. The first incident I can remember involved his weird sleeping habits. He has OCD, so he needed things just so, and I was either in preschool or kindergarten, so we could still get away with climbing in bed with our parents when we had a nightmare. After a few months, my mom disallowed this and Donald began coming to my room. I agreed, being a good big sister, but I came to regret it. Donald's OCD demanded he be in the exact center of the bed with the blankets tucked in around him so that no moving air could touch him. This meant that me being on the edge of my full-sized bed wasn't good enough as I lifted the blankets, and given it was winter, I wasn't willing to be without my blankets, just so his sensitivities could be satisfied by me freezing my butt off outside the blankets for him. We used to live in Illinois, so the winters weren't fun in only flannel jammies and a stuffy without anything else. I tried compromising, saying he could have the 2 lower blankets around him, if I could have the upper blanket and comforter. No, he had to have all 4 blankets tucked about him and the flat sheet. He'd also prefer if I didn't wiggle my bed while he slept. We had hissed arguments that ended one day with him curling up and kicking me out of my own bed like a goat with such force that my head hit the end table next to my bed as I was violently ejected. I must have cried out because my parents were in the room in no time and my lights were on. I was terrified that Donald had blinded me as I couldn't see with my good eye, but it was only because blood got in my eye from where my eyebrow was split open. He tried once more to come into my room at night, some time later, but after having been to the hospital to be sure Donald hadn't blinded me, I was done letting him sleep with me after a nightmare, and he thought an appropriate retaliation was leaving my bedroom light on until I let him in. We both got lectured by Mom for being wasteful children who ought to have known better. Not the only time Donald's hurt me, but every time after this was purposeful and calculated. After Dad got stationed in California in the early 90s, Donald showed an interest in tools, so one summer when we visited our grandparents in Texas, Papa and Donald did a lot of things together, like making those plastic models of cars and Navy ships, and when Donald asked about tools, they made a simple wooden toolkit, and they went to the hardware store for a simple set of tools, including the usual hammer, 2 screwdrivers, hand drill, and something else I can't remember. I had no interest in this, but that drill would become a thorn in my side later. They also made a pretty cool birdhouse for our grandparents' backyard. I just wanted to watch the majesty of them assembling a replica of the US Arizona, painted, and put the stickers on it one day. Donald enjoyed this activity and tried to gatekeep it. I asked my mom if I could watch them and was told to ask Papa. Papa was okay with an observer who was interested, and I sat at the small table by my brother to watch and listen and ask questions since the box looked interesting. I learned that a member of the family, my grandma's sister, had married a man who survived Pearl Harbor, and that a segment of the ship had washed up on the beach where the colonel had found it. A sticker was pointed out with the ship's name on it. I asked more questions about this new branch of the family I'd never met, and Donald began blocking me from seeing around him, even looking over his shoulder to be sure I couldn't see the pieces and stickers, as if that would stop me from asking about Pearl Harbor and how our family tree was involved. The colonel couldn't keep the shard of the ship, of course, but he was allowed a picture of it to hang in his house, which I did see years later. Donald wasn't smart, and when he picked up on that, I wasn't going to give up. He turned around and tried to hit me, but Papa grabbed his arm and told him not to hit girls, and that I could sit by him instead to see the assembly process. I wasn't touching the pieces of the model. I wasn't touching the paints or glue. I didn't even want to touch the stickers. I wanted to watch them make it and soak up the trivia around the original ship and our family. Donald just wasn't interested in the history behind his models, and resented that I was bonding with Grandpa over that desire to know more. After we got home after the trip to Texas, Donald got to town with his hand drill. He was told it was not for casual use and never in the house unsupervised. But he got down to business, drilling holes in the wooden fencing at base housing to spy on neighbors, and promptly got in trouble for it. After he realized he'd get whooped when Mom was home, he would wait and put shallow quarter or half-inch holes in his furniture and in the baseboards. He hid his furniture modifications under toys and other things to try and delay vengeance. And when he was done with his room, he moved to modify my furniture as well. I caught him aligning his drill over a series of pencil marks he made for the purpose on the top of my dresser, and I yelled for our parents because he was using the drill in the house. He got mad and swung the drill at my face, nailing me above the eye on my good eye, the same side he'd put a scar on with my own end table, and I went to the hospital again. My glasses saved me, and the bit gouged out a line in the lenses which deflected the metal to my eyebrow. More bleeding, more crying. This time I needed stitches. After I got home from the hospital to be sure he hadn't blinded me. It turns out Mom's only punishment to Donald was to take away the offending tool and to scream at him for damaging base housing. Dad dragged Donald to Home Depot for spackle and paint, forced Donald to patch up every hole in the walls and baseboards, and grounded him for a month for hurting me. Donald had to live with the holes he put in his furniture since it was his own fault it was damaged. I wasn't even in the 3rd grade yet. Elementary to middle school was full of me getting fresh new scars because of Donald's violent tendencies, including, but not limited to, the time he cut the tip off my finger, lying to get out of doing his fair share of the chores, stealing and breaking my glasses, stealing and hiding things and blaming me for it, until I was punished only to miraculously find them and be rewarded for it. He learned about brown nosing and sucked up to Mom and embarrassing me publicly, and even his punishments were lighter, with items only being taken away temporarily, while anything Mom found offensive of mine was donated. He was allowed to make his room smell like pee, engineered instance where I would trip or hurt myself around the house, and convinced Mom that I was somehow a cow who ate all the food in the house, so that I was disallowed from opening anything in the kitchen that wasn't already opened, so that he could open my favorite cereal or snacks and gorge himself on over half of whatever it was before anyone else had a chance. But I somehow was at fault even if I followed the new stupid rule, because Donald would never eat more than his fair share, unlike my fat blind arse. I caught him eating the green, blue, and purple Fruit Loops specifically out of the cereal to ensure he had the lion's share, and tried to convince me it was a factory defect where our box was missing them. Dad and I caught him with the bottles of coffee creamer he hid in his room to drink like chocolate milk, because he liked the taste of them, and Mom only grounded him for a week. I caught him trying to steal fruit pies from the grocery store once, and I got backhanded in public for trying to shame my brother about his new medicine, while Mom handed the pastries to the cashier to return since she wasn't about to get them. Yes, my brother was put on a new medicine whose side effect was an increase in appetite, and instead of acknowledged that his bloating and the subsequent increased consumption of food wasn't related. That the scrawny twig that was me at the time was a voracious black hole who was trying to pin the blame on my little brother. It wasn't until the coffee creamer was discovered that the Abraxas can't open boxes or bags or bottles rule was voided. But there was never an apology. Not from Donald for trying to make me out as the bad guy. Not from Mom, who treated me like a villain. All during this grounding, and ever since Donald brown-nosed for Mom's attention and retaliated in small ways she'd defend. As long as he didn't cuss, he was allowed to call me anything he wanted and insisted that and all of the things done so that I wouldn't lose my vision, like having glasses, and announcing if you were coming at me from my blind side, were menial details that were beneath him, and that he didn't have to do them because I was worthless and didn't mean anything to him or anyone. He got especially potty-mouthed after every doctor's appointment to ensure that my condition was stable, after every vision prescription renewal, every trip to the optometrist to get new glasses, and every repair shop visit. Mom enrolled the two of us in adolescent therapy, and I was told that perhaps the reason my brother was acting out was because he was jealous of the attention I got from our parents due to my vision. As if we didn't both have to see doctors for ADHD. I got nothing from these sessions other than that I was somehow at fault for resenting that every electronic that entered the house went to my brother before I might be given one. That his emotional stagnation due to his mental issues meant he tried to get attention the only way he knew how, which was by lashing out, and that I had to be the bigger person and not retaliate. I was prescribed sleep medications since every sound in the house woke me up with fear for my things. They gave me antidepressants because I was showing signs of depression despite my young age in addition to meds for ADHD. What did Donald have to be jealous of that? I got painful eye drops dropped into my face every few months and got picked on for wearing glasses. If he hurt me so badly, I got rushed to a hospital because of his actions. Why did he resent me for having our parents' attention? I was not a menial detail. He didn't know the meaning of the word, he thought it sounded fancy. He was raised knowing better than to hit girls, and he came at me from my blind side regularly to hit and run, and Mom let him get away with it. Later he'd stick to obstinate, which I kinda was. But that was after I realized my mom was a trash parent who just wanted to mistreat me for not being a stupid parrot like Donald was. I was in middle school and maxed out on my dosage on antidepressants appropriate for my height and weight. Donald was also violent and aggressive about video games and had to be the winner or else. We used to head to a rec center on base with our mom that let you trade in your military ID for an hour of time on a N64 or a computer or other such activities, and we used to play a Kirby game, Smash Brothers, or some Pokemon game. My vision quickly became apparent as a hindrance, since if there was too much movement or not enough contrast, I couldn't see my character, and I stopped touching the controller to find them. In Smash, this meant that my brother always chose a character who blended in with a stage and ran about making the camera move, so that I lost my ability to react before he punted me off the stage repeatedly, and I began to refuse to play this game with him, which he tried to cry to Mom about. This led us to playing the Pokemon game because we had to learn it, share and play together, and I was being a selfish brat for not wanting to do that with Donald. In the Pokemon game, Donald ignored my questions about what each Pokemon did, why they were different, what the types meant, and why we had to pick 6. Initially, I picked ones I liked the look of and got wiped out. Then I noticed he kept swapping out his team when one of mine was brought out, so I did the same, not understanding. I could easily see in this game, but my brother was purposefully trying to keep me in the dark about the mechanics, so he could get cheap wins that he'd hold over my head like they meant anything outside the game. The Pokemon show in TCG was all the rage, so between visits to the rec center, I had to ask other kids in the neighborhood and class for the information to get good, and eventually, I developed a strategy to beat the ever-living out of my brother's team, which all hinged on Chansey being a damaged sponge, and keeping me stupid about Hitmonlee being the only real option to slap it silly. Donald got mad when he realized I'd gotten smart, and he lied about agreeing not to use his pink tank and tried to hit me every time I chose my counter to his BS. When that failed, he tried to pretend he wasn't going to use it and switch it out so he could get his meaningless victory again. Again, I got wise to his tactic, and it stopped working, which ticked him off. The mama's boy ran to Mommy and cried that I wasn't playing fair, and she watched us play games together, where he never chose his tank, though he hovered over it, and I hovered over the kickboxer. If he wanted to play a stupid game in front of Mom, I was going to shame him in front of her by being a damn winner. Mom saw nothing wrong, and was glad I wasn't bang about having to play a game with my brother. This Cold War lasted until I got my dad into the rec center, and taught him what to do, and when to whoop the crap out of the pink tank when Donald slipped it in sideways. Dad thought it was fun, and thought I was a great teacher. Donald refused to play with me anymore. Same story when we eventually got a PS2 and played Digimon Rumble Arena. Except I learned Gatomon was powerful and Seraphimon was his go-to for cheap victories he'd preen over. Our together time in Rumble Arena ended the same way our together time in Brawl did. All I wanted to do at the rec center was play with my Neopets, not fight with my brother. We didn't get a PS2 until middle school, and it was bought for my brother for Christmas. We were expected to share the console and its games, controllers, and memory cards. On paper, this was fine if he wasn't a numpty when it came to victory and power trips, but he was. Despite it being his gift, Mom put it in the living room, and initially I had to ask his permission to play anything, which he never gave. It took me asking Mom every day for permission to play, being sent to Donald and going back to Mom for her to rescind that, and Donald threw a tantrum that I'd gone above his head. Back then there weren't many save files per game, and I made sure I used a different file on the games we played, so that I wouldn't reset his progress. Eventually, I had to move to the last save, as being in the save nest to him lead to accidental deletions that sent me back to square one. weekly and almost daily. I tried telling Mom, but she brushed it off, saying that I was just going to get better at the games with this practice, and that Donald didn't mean it. I watched him scan the save files on the memory card for any data saves that weren't his, and watched him delete mine or overwrite it with his, and say that I wasn't allowed to play that game until he got through a hard section that required him to hoard every save file available. I was not allowed to use this excuse to try and protect my singular save file, and I got backhanded by Mom whenever I tried, while watching my brother repeatedly set me back time and again, because it was his games, his console, and his memory card. Dad eventually had enough, and we went to the Navy Exchange to get me a yellow memory card that couldn't be confused with Donald's red one, and I used my card to preserve my progress. Realizing Donald wouldn't like me taking this power from him, I kept my memory card on me at all times out of fear that he'd come looking for it, and after a mere week and a half of my freedom from his deletion overriding, he decided to rip through my room, while Mom was out at the commissary to get it. Once again, I caught him, and we had a fight in the middle of my room, which Dad broke up and sat us in timeout until Mom got home. Mom didn't understand why we were still fighting about save files, when I had my own memory card now, and Donald cooked up a tall tale of having maxed out his memory card and needing to use mine to continue playing one of his games. If it weren't for Dad, Mom would have eaten the rotten sack of lies like it was the last bag of chocolate in the world and forced me to hand mine over. Dad pointed out that we had less than 10 games, and we each had a 16 GB memory card, so it was physically impossible for Donald to have overfilled it, even if he was using every last save slot in every game we had. When it was time to put up or shut up, it came out that Donald had plenty of room on his card, and he sulked off without any punishment at all, while I was grounded for picking a fight with my brother in my bedroom. Thanks, Mom. Part 2. Once again, there may be triggering themes. TLDR. Just when you thought my entitled brother would grow out of it. In late middle school going into high school, we got our second gaming item. Game Boy Advances for Christmas. Donald's was the popular semi-transparent purple, while mine was a pretty tweedy yellow color from the Giraffe toy store. We were given separate games, with me primarily getting Sonic games, and he getting Pokemon ones. I did have the Pokemon game, though, with the introduction of a female trainer, and I loved it because that was my only complaints about the first Pokemon games. I had to be a boy. Just like with the PlayStation, Donald tried to steal and hide the Game Boy in his room, but a few whippings from Dad, and he knocked that off by spring break, and had to be content that he was the only one with a link cable. I didn't care about the link cable. I didn't need or want a Jenga, but I'd accept an Alakazam if he was desperate for one. I guess by this time Mom got the idea that Daniel shared electronics poorly and stopped forcing me to use his things. Mostly. As we got into high school, we desperately wanted privacy and began closing our bedroom doors to try and enforce a safe space. Donald was a doormat to Mom and allowed her to do whatever she wanted, and figured that throwing a closed door open and talking at the room's occupant was normal, and did so to me. As if he was a divine gift from Mom with all the permissions in the world to interrupt my homework or downtime, and was offended when I screamed at him to get out when I was changing. I asked him to knock before entering, and told him to knock. Went to Mom and Dad when he insisted on not knocking, and cracking jokes when he caught me changing a few times, and was told by Mom to try harder to get him to understand that he had to knock. Meanwhile, I got thrown out of his room and had Hot Wheels thrown at me if I didn't knock loudly enough on my brother's door to get his attention, even though he made a point to ignore me calling out to him in his room when I wasn't carrying a message from Mom. Remember, I'm a menial, obstinate detail he can't be bothered to remember, and he's stuck to that. I had to play dirty as I had once before, using my brother's OCD against him once again to enforce my will in my room. He hated being ignored and wanted people to acknowledge him whenever he entered a room, which I refused to do if he wouldn't show me the basic courtesy of knocking on my door to be sure I wasn't naked. I told him once, and only once per intrusion, that I wasn't going to listen to a word he said until he knocked, and I applied this to the entire house. Mom was of course above the rules and would deliver a backhanded slap whenever I tried to insist on my personal space, since Donald didn't make her knock, so why should she knock for me? Dad picked up on my tactic to force Donald's compliance and smiled whenever he realized Donald had broken my rule to argue that he was allowed to enter whenever he wanted. Dad would knock on my door frame, and I gave Dad permission to enter. The two of us had a conversation until Donald stopped being an entitled brat and knocked on the door frame as well. Then we both acknowledged him and engaged in whatever thing he wanted to talk about. Usually robots, K-Nex, or Pokemon. Donald eventually learned when I was going to college that he had to knock every single time, and not just when he felt like it. Only took him 6 years to learn how to be a decent human being in that regard, And I had to do it with only my dad's support since Mom was making a terrible example for my brother. The reason he thought he was allowed to enter my personal space is because Mom invaded our personal space daily, and Donald was used to being allowed to do whatever Mom did. I set boundaries with my brother that I could enforce. I maintained my boundaries, even when I was grounded or mistreated by Mom. I had to do this with only my dad's help most times, because I never had Mom's support when it came to my brother, unless he sent me to the hospital. And I didn't feel bad about using his sensitivities against him in this manner. I have scars up and down my arms and legs. Some self-inflicted, since physical pain was better than the emotional and mental pain I was in every day at home due to how Mom and brother treated me. Some due to one tantrum or another that Donald threw that made me bleed. I'm not proud to admit it, but at the end of high school and on into the early months of college, Donald and I actually fought a lot, and the neighbors began to call the cops. This was around the item of Mom's dry run at a divorce. During this time, even locked doors didn't stop him, as Donald found out that by sticking one of his screwdrivers through the tiny unlock hole of the doorknobs in the house that he could gain entry anywhere, and he had so much fun using and abusing this since I could only shout at him to get out and leave me alone. One of his biggest gripes was about our only paid chore, washing the dog at the beginning of the month for $5. First come, first served. The dog was blameless and honestly wasn't overly fond of the baths, but the shouting scared her, and she hid under my bed or in the master bedroom closet when we both got going. All Donald had to do to get the money was to wash the dog in the morning, since I washed her after school, but he couldn't be bothered to wake up any earlier than minimally required to get ready for school. Looking back, it's ridiculous that we were fighting over $5 washing a terrier when we had so many other chores that other kids got paid to do. But it was literally the only allowance offered, and it only went to one of us. Donald had been grumping and hollering that he wanted the $5, and that I needed to let him wash the dog since he was tired of missing out. I pointed out that he had a half day and could have done it before I got home, so if he missed out it was his own damn fault, and I shoved him out of the room with the dog in the tub and locked the door once he cleared the doorframe. Again, he grabbed his screwdriver and began screaming that he was going to beat me up if I didn't let him in and wash the dog from then on. But I braced against the door and tried to keep it closed with my weight, even though he was heavier and I was on a tiled floor. He eventually came in, and we had a fight in the bathroom where he broke the cheap plastic cup you use to rinse your mouth after brushing. I tried to fight back. I bit him, scratched him, tried to kick him and rip out his hair. He tried to strangle me, and I played dead so that he would think that he'd done the job and would leave me alone. Not long after the cops arrived, and I don't remember what happened. He got in trouble for breaking the cup and had to buy Mom a new one. We both got in trouble for the cops coming over and lost gaming privileges for a month. After I graduated high school, I was gifted a Game Boy Advance SP in the limited champagne color. I still have it. It's well loved. It was the one thing I had that Donald didn't, and it was a Christmas present, so I didn't have to hand it over right away to share. When we opened our stockings the next day, I was ecstatic to find one of those clips on lighted magnifiers in silver, so that it kinda matched my portable, so that I could see without having the portable near my face. I also finally got one of those external memory cartridges courtesy of Dad, since Donald still had accidents with my save files. Donald begged to play with my present after my birthday, and I was required by Mom to share and not be a bee about it. I begrudgingly let him use it, but only as a part of his allotted game time granted by Mom, so that he couldn't hang on to it for days and days, because this was mine. He tried to push this policy by trying to smash my fingers inside the SP when I went to reclaim it, and by this time I was so used to physical pain that I didn't care. I just grabbed the now closed portable and threatened to tell Dad if he broke skin before I stormed off to my room. Donald tried to weasel his way into using my magnifier accessory, but I sure as hell wasn't about to let him touch the delicate thing that let me play the game normally and in my bed at night under the covers. If he was willing to use my disc of Jack X Combat Racing as a coaster because he was too lazy to find a real one, I didn't want to know what he'd do with a flimsy bit of plastic and glass that had moving parts. I stood my ground when confronted by Mom for being an ungrateful bee about the magnifier, but she had no defense for herself or my brother when I asked why Donald needed my magnifier when he was the only one in the family who didn't need glasses. Was glad not to have to need glasses, and had gone out of the way to try and disassemble some of my visual aids from the Dana Center, which we were being lent, and had to return in the next month undamaged, or we'd not get a security deposit back. I'm sure I had a whooping coming from Mom, but Dad stepped in and laid down the law, saying that Donald was being entitled again, and that he had bought the magnifier for me after Mom bought me the SP. Donald didn't need the magnifier, and if I didn't want to share it, I didn't have to. I reiterated that I didn't want him touching the magnifier or my external memory pack because I couldn't trust him not to mess with it like he had attempted with my PS2 memory card in the past, and that he hadn't replaced the disc he ruined yet. Eventually, when we were both in high school, Donald broke his console, and it would only play PS1 games and CDs. I was proud of myself for figuring out that it was because CDs and PS1 games shared a read format, while DVD and PS2 games shared one, and that Donald had broken the machine's ability to break those. Super basic, but I liked puzzling things out. Since the incident with the memory cards, Dad had gotten himself a console and Mom moved this out of the master bedroom and into the living room without Dad's permission, since she absolutely hated that Dad hid in the bedroom after getting home from work playing children's games like War Jets, Thunder Tanks, Twisted Metal Small Brawl, and Tiny Tank. It had been years, and I was eventually bought my own console, which replaced the one taken from the master bedroom since I wasn't allowed to keep it in mine. I made a point of pointing out to Mom and Donald every few months that this was my console, and those were my controllers that I used Mom's nail polish on, and I was playing my games on it. Donald kept trying to show preference for my machine and to steal my controllers, but the nail polish on the cable and controller made it impossible for him to just use it instead of his own, and the go-to place to find my stolen things was his room buried in his toy box. Now that I was free of him entirely for console, games, and memory, he was mad, and was stupidly stealing my things to try and get even. All he got was a whooping from Dad until he figured out this wasn't working, and he finally let me be when Mom insisted we didn't need separate copies. He demanded that I not play his copies, and that I have my own of any games. We just needed to grow up and share them. I begrudgingly agreed to this since I had Threads of Fate and Sonic Adventure 2, which he liked, and he had Rumble Arena, which I liked. I was constantly afraid he'd have an accident, though, which would ruin my game discs. My poor combat racing. I wish I could say he got better in this regard, but he didn't. When we were adults, he had the PS3 that was backwards compatible, and I had the Xbox 360, but we each had games to the other person's console. Another brilliant idea of Mom's to force us to share and make nice. I didn't mind him using my Xbox as long as he didn't gum up my controllers. But he sure didn't like that I had to enter his room to play any PlayStation games, since he was allowed to keep his new toy in his room. But mine was relegated to the living room, where I had to deny the entire house any chance at watching TV, just so I could play my games. By now I had a TV that could host my console, but I was only allowed to keep my brother's old GameCube in there, and even then I had to swap out the inputs of my video eye for the GameCube, which Mom was steadfast in me not being allowed to do on my own. I did anyway because screw that noise. I was an adult, and I knew the value of $1, and wasn't a hairy-knuckle gorilla, the way she liked to tell people I was. She loved to say bull in a china shop. Funny, I wasn't a fat frog like Donald, nor did I have a boiling rage and desire to beat the crap out of people like he did. Around this time, Dad was freshly retired from the military, and the family dynamic was shot to hell and back with Mom harassing me and Dad and rewarding Donald. Donald was pitching in and joining this tirade of mistreatment because he has been a dumb parrot of Mom's since elementary school. It was easier for him to be a doormat and let all the injustice and inequality wash over him than to stand against the flow and do the right thing no matter how much it hurt. Donald also met his boyfriend Andy, who none of us cared for since, well, the guy was just not okay. Donald's boyfriend was allowed to come over every day or every other day, while Mom threw a fit when I wanted to leave the house to see my longtime bestie, and now boyfriend Bubbles. Donald was allowed to have his boyfriend Badger the family into going to a Japanese market to buy ethnic food, since clearly the Japanese diet is superior, and I was required to humor this. Pennywort drinks and a fondness of ramen are all I took away from these trips. I never tried to force my boyfriend's Italian roots and foods onto anyone, and I doubt I'd be allowed that either. Donald and Andy even tried to sell my 360 for cash so they could go to a second-hand store that specialized in second-hand Japanese goods, other trinkets. Donald was grounded for this attempt, but was allowed to stay in his room with his PS3 for as long as he wanted, and I was told to drop the entire situation because nothing ended up happening since Dad caught them disconnecting my console while I was out with Bubbles. Andy was disallowed from coming over for 3 blissful months. I'm pretty sure Andy disliked that he couldn't sell my SHT from under me and that I wasn't buying into his nonsense. So Andy convinced Donald that me keeping my console in its upright position was wrong and waited until he had been using it for 15-20 minutes to turn it on its side, because it's better before they continue to play some new translated game. This warped my console's motherboard and I got the ROT. I freaked out because I heard stories about this, and I tried so hard to be careful and not put it at risk. Dad was a military-trained electrician, and he took my poor baby apart to find the damage, determine if it was fixable. Unfortunately, it was unfixable, and Andy quipped in the weeks after that sometimes these things happen, that the Xbox had a pretty high failure rate, and that it was probability time for a new one anyway. Dad told Andy that that was not the case, and that it looked like someone had warped the motherboard with a heat gun, or by shifting it during normal operations. I hate my mother, but she did pipe up about having witnessed Andy flipping it constantly for months, and that she hadn't thought it was too big a problem since all I had to do was set the console upright when I wanted to play it. I was furious at Andy, at Donald for letting Andy do this to me, and at Mom for letting them both do that to the first console that wasn't passed down by Donald. I ended up getting a 360 arcade with reduced memory and no internet capacity as a replacement that I was stonewalled about getting, as I clearly didn't need it according to Donald and Mom. Even though it saw daily use by Donald, Dad, and myself, and by denying me a replacement, Donald would have nothing to play some of his games on. My dad took me shopping in town, going to various military bases in the area and electronic stores, before we settled on a 360 arcade from Fry's Electronics that had no internet capacity and bare-bones memory capacity to dissuade Donald and Andy from trying to pull their stunt again. I also laid down the rule that as a guest, Andy was not allowed to touch this console without my express permission, and no, Donald was not allowed to proxy Andy into permission after last time. Also, that if I caught them turning my console on its side, I was going to keep the power cable in my room whenever Andy came over so that he couldn't play it at all. Donald somehow thought I wouldn't notice I was missing Tron Evolution and one of my controllers going missing, and complained that I was overreacting about this whole scenario when he was once again caught. I didn't care. That was my SHT, and no one tried breaking my SHT and got away with it. He got stolen from me like I was until some point in high school because of Mom's consistent 5-finger discount under the guise of cleaning. He knew better than to steal from me. Donald just didn't care because Andy wanted money and couldn't get a job because he was a POS. With the challenges I had, I pretty much threw up the white flag when it came to driving, as being a glorified cyclops at the helm of a ton or more machine terrified me, not only for myself, but others on the road. Even if technically I could own a car and be driven around. Didn't want a car, didn't need a car, wasn't about to own a car, no. Andy didn't like this either, thinking that my brother could use the experience of driving as an adult. The thought of my brother being able to drive gave me nightmares and trauma flashbacks to every scare he ever gave me, including the ones hidden in my eyebrows. Told Andy to WFF off and get a car himself if he thought it was such a good idea for my brother to get behind the wheel, and good luck with insurance after road rage eventually kicked in. To be fair, Dad had tried to get Donald to take driver's ed courses in high school, but my brother didn't care and slept through the class, since anything he wanted or any place he wanted to go could be handled by Mom. There's nothing wrong with public transportation, but there's some things you just can't do on a bus that you could do in a car. Mom kept promising Donald that she could arrange for a driving instructor as an adult student, but somehow this never happened, but Donald never pursued it. Eventually, Dad offered to teach Donald in his beat-up old Tacoma, and Donald refused because he didn't want to be in Dad's car. Dad offered to pay for an instructor in whatever kind of car they have, and Donald didn't want that since Mom promised. I straight up told Dad that I was not comfortable with the thought of my brother behind the wheel. Any wheel, but kept my peace since it seemed driving was being used as a control tactic to try and push Andy out of our lives, and I knew it wouldn't work, since Donald didn't care. Wash, rinse, and repeat until I moved out in 2013, and I hear from Dad that without a clear target that Mom and Donald were focusing on the only other person in the house to mistreat, and I felt guilty. I did, however, still feel burning resentment when hearing that Donald decided to take culinary classes, and that not only did Mom get him all the tools for class, but she had his set of knives engraved with his name and a Triforce symbol. Fine, whatever, I didn't live there anymore. But it still hurt that during my art classes, I got generic things that weren't personalized, and Donald got a custom engraving. I was proud of him, though, for finding a purpose in college, and that he was chasing it down with a passion I knew he had but never showed. I thought maybe he was finally growing out of his entitlement. But I was wrong when Dad relayed to me that Donald was applying for fast food jobs with his certifications and training because he couldn't get any paid work at local restaurants. The reason he wants to get paid work is that he lacked experience at these places, and they were offering him an internship to learn the ropes in a live setting, as is normal for that particular industry. Donald was, however, too good to do the work of a normal person, and put his item and effort into getting certifications to work, and chose to work at an ice cream shop and a deli counter working minimum wage. He cooked fancy meals at home, which Mom liked, but the brat cooked reduced portions so that Dad wouldn't get any, or if there were leftovers after Donald and Mom ate, Dad was harassed greatly for taking the leftovers. The last time I saw my brother was at Christmas a few years ago. He was wearing glasses, and apparently he and Mom took to cooking meals together that I, as the guest, didn't know about. I was already set for an awkward holiday, with this being the last one. Dad said I'd see him and Mom together. He still worked as a contractor and left early in the mornings, and on one of these workdays Mom got this idea that again on paper sounded fine: making pancakes with my brother, while she tried to report maintenance issues to the property management company. I wasn't sure about this, but us being only 10 feet from Mom, I hoped that he'd be smart and not take a swing. All I had to do was hold the ladle and spoon out of the batter for Donald while he cooked the pancakes. The spoon was to tap chocolate chips into the poured pancakes. It seemed to be going well with me having to watch my brother, and to hand him the ladle or spoon as requested. But me still having a DD, I got distracted when he flicked some water in the fresh oil of the pan. It was one of the tips Mom told me about to see if oil is the proper heat to add foods to. If you've ever had a DD or ADHD, you know it really doesn't take much to distract you. I tuned back into my task to Donald calling me a bee as she snatched the utensils from me, and I glared at him, turned and left to the guest room. I didn't say a word. I didn't swing back. I didn't make a scene. I walked away. Didn't even slam my door. After her call, Mom coaxed me out to figure out what happened since Donald complained that the handles of the utensils were in the batter. My holding of them kept this from happening, and that I was being obstinate and ignoring him. He tried to cook up a pity party, but what happened next is odd, and partially why I'm only in low contact with Mom and no contact with Donald. She asked my story of the ordeal, and I told her about my distraction. I wasn't blamed. She pointed out after 30 years that Donald was wrong, that as he had a DD too, that he knows how little it takes to be distracted, and that he was raised knowing that I needed to be redirected appropriately if I wasn't looking at something that was on my blind side, and not be called horrible things. He huffed and puffed and tried to make a case, but after half an hour the pancakes went cold, and he apologized. I declared I'd not be cooking with him again, because I was worth more than cheap insults, and didn't need to be treated that way as a guest in the house, much less as family. I didn't care if Donald and Mom had a system of cooking built on years of close association and cooking. I was new to this, and for Donald to assume I'd psychically know what to do was stupid. Cooking tip: do not add things to the plain batter of the pancake right away. The chance of non-batter touching the pan is pretty good, and can burn the additive. By adding the bits when the first side of the pancake is somewhat cooked, you can have a perfect fluffy pancake with the nuts or chocolate you want in them buried in batter that isn't burned or overcooked. Update: the reason I have issues with food and cooking, thanks Mom. Had a commenter grave dig my post to try and shame me for an incident. I mentioned where my entitled mother stole food and tried to argue that parents do what they do out of love, and that I have no right to not appreciate everything they do. So let's debunk this new trend and shed light on the food stealing now that I know a few other things with my dad's input as well. It seems ever since I was little Mom was aggressive with food. Mom has always been a psalm and would make dinner for both me and my brother and pack us off to bed. We lived in Illinois by that Naval Academy, and were far enough away that Dad would come home after Mom had put us down for the night. So I guess I always assumed, as children do, that parents are godly and fair, and that Mom had set aside dinner for Dad. No, she didn't, and she forbade him to cook after he got home, or it would wake us. Often my dad, who was a young 20-something, could only have a teacup of salsa and a bowl of tortilla strips for dinner. His equally young 20-something wife, who smoked a pack a week to stay thin, and was at the time a vegan, was being horrible, and I never knew. His breakfast consisted of coffee and a few of those rice cake things. Lunch was ramen, a Coke, and a Nutter Butter. I thought I hit the jackpot as a kid finding the chocolate treat, and my dad got mad when I took it once. I didn't understand then, but now I feel like an awful person back then, because that was his second highest caloric intake. Weekday dinners were chips and salsa, or nothing, with weekends meaning he got to eat with us. He got to eat well, because he stuck to my brother, and I not to be starved. This is supposedly around the time the wall fell, if my mom's tales of how horrid Dad was for clattering the kitchens after bedtime are any indication. After we moved to California with Dad's new duty station, his duty station was closer to base housing, and could be home for dinner, but he maintained the chips and salsa habit. As my brother and I got older, we had the usual appetite of growing kids. Mom tried to limit our intake, saying that we shouldn't be going through this or that any faster than some arbitrary time, and attempted to implement a rule that would restrict us to a fair share of a snack. There was a lot of pushback, as my brother's OCD meant he'd keep horking food unless personally overseen, but he'd throw a fit if overseen, so I had to get into everything first for my bit. Mom wasn't pleased that her rules lead to food aggression in us, and her solution was that whichever kid she caught eating an unauthorized snack or unapproved amount of a shack would have to stand in the middle of the kitchen and stick their hand out to receive a slap from the fly gut-covered fly swatter. If you pulled your hand back, she got you in the face with the second swing. This didn't stop the food aggression, and my brother was often let off the hook because of his condition. We both still cheered every time she snapped that cheap fly swatter, because it meant we weren't going to get hit in the face. I got curious about why Mom made key lime pie instead of buying it at the commissary, and she said, "Okay, let's do both, and you'll see." So I was a part of the process of making an icebox pie, and was honestly curious. Also excited, as this meant we'd have 2 pies, and I was looking forward to that the most. So we had the pre-made pie first, and it was okay. We had 1 piece each, and could all have a second, so being good kids, we didn't think about having 2 pieces after dinner. After a few days, I am in the fridge for some reason before I take a shower, and I go to find Mom to let her know I was going to have my second piece of pie after my shower. Something told me to tell my brother that his was in the fridge, and if he had his today, we could have the new pie tomorrow. After my shower, we looking for my pie, and it's gone. So I go to see where Mom was, and she's got my plate with my pie, and is poking the last bite in her mouth. Dad also had a slice, my brother's slice. I felt so betrayed and told Donald, who pitched an unholy OCD fit. Dad said he had no idea it was our pie and asked Mom why she didn't tell him. Second pie, the homemade one. This didn't go any better. Still being the innocent second grader I was, I figured Mom would make up the difference with the next pie, and resolved not to make the same mistake of trusting that no one would mess with my SHD. Of course, when I brought up the fair share rule, meant she had to give us the pie she stole by giving us each an extra slice on this one, Mom laughed and sent me away. Okay, fine, I guess kids shouldn't have 3/4 of a pie between them. But I sure as hell wasn't going to leave my pie in the fridge and lose it to that goat-faced excuse of a mother again. This time I kept trying to get the pie every night after dinner, and was denied every single time by Mom. Donald was also pissed and pestered Mom for his, but was denied as well. His brilliant idea one day a week later was to sneak out of his bedroom in the dead of night to sneak into the kitchen and have it. He could have gotten away with it too if he hadn't made any noise getting a fork. Donald managed to eat half of his second slice before Mom found him, so she threw it out in front of him. She did the same to mine, even though I only tried once a day and didn't sneak into the kitchen at midnight like my brother. I was curled up in fear hearing the meaty smacks of Mom whooping him in the middle of the kitchen, and I couldn't figure out why he thought this would work. I was too scared to even get out of bed to pee when I had to, because I didn't want to be backhanded for waking her up. We already had food aggression about getting our share. Now we broke into snacks faster, so our share couldn't be taken from us before we got it. She snapped many fly swatters after this, but we never stopped. She stole our dessert twice among many other kids' foods. We weren't losing anything else. By this time, my brother's new medicine had a side effect of increased appetite, and he began swelling like a balloon and stealing food to satisfy the medicine-fueled starvation. Everything about fair share was gone for him, and my food aggression got worse because I knew everything I liked would end up in his weaselly black gusts. No joke. He opened a box of Fruit Loops and sorted it to eat only the blue, green, and purple ones, consuming over half to the brand new cereal box, and tried to convince me that all Fruit Loops came that way when I brought it up. He got into cans of olives, stole entire bottles of coffee creamer, and hid them in his room to drink like chocolate milk, demolished boxes of Hot Pockets with impunity. Worse still was he ate straight from the containers of ice cream with a spoon that he licked clean between each bite, and I caught him at that nasty act. I tattled, and every time he got screamed at but rarely hit, and I was sent away to my room. Then Donald got smart and focused on eating every sweet thing that I liked. At first I thought he was doing this to be petty and deny me snacks, but the real truth came at me like a 150 freight train to redden my butt. Donald blamed the missing sweets on me, as I was the kid with a sweet tooth, and every time I pointed the blame where it belonged. Proof or not, I got a whooping, and if anything, my brother was only lectured and was rarely whopped. I got backhanded so much that I began to convince myself that crying was a weakness, and that if I stopped crying, Mom would stop hitting me. I had one of those cheap talk girl Walkman, and in the 6th grade, I was recording my brother admitting fault for his gorging and intent to blame me, and it made no difference to Mom. But to Dad? Donald got his punishments, and my brother began trying to steal the recorder that was only really capable of a single message, no longer than 30 seconds. I made sure to tell Dad so Donald would get punished, and I'd get my stuff back. After my brother finally got his dosage managed, Mom decided that manners were next on the list of things we needed to address right after my farting problem, as us kids took after Dad, who ate like a sailor. Which is to say, quickly, and without table manners mostly. She also heavily regulated food, now that my father wasn't starving to get him to a healthy weight. What she wanted us to learn was table etiquette. What we learned was quite the opposite. Her decision on correcting us was thusly: if you put any part of you that didn't belong on the table, she'd stab it with her fork hard enough to hurt, but not bruise. If you ate with your mouth open or didn't chew enough, she'd reach over and pop you in the mouth. If your napkin fell out of your lap, she'd stab you in the wrist, whether you were about to take a bite or not, and point at the floor. If you didn't give her the time of day, or she grew tired of stabbing you, you didn't eat any more that night. If for any reason she took your food, you just didn't eat the rest of the night. If you looked like you were going to finish dinner before her, you cleaned the entire kitchen by yourself. Whichever kid finished their plate first had to clean the stove and oven. She ignored Dad's objections when she got too aggressive, and she was far faster at stabbing than our dad was at stopping her without physically restraining her. Honestly, he got better results when she was absent from the table for one reason or the other. Mom also refused to stop stabbing us, even though Dad tried to tell her that he didn't like the effect it was having on our overall behavior, and not just at the dinner table. Donald's outbursts were getting worse ever since she started this line of motivation. My brother stabbed her back by the third day and managed to break skin, but learned that that wasn't worth it after a 10-minute arse whooping. She also decided that since we all had gas, that we needed to chew our food 250 times before swallowing or getting another bite, and she enforced this by taking our plates from under our noses. I don't remember what happened to the food on the plates, but it wasn't seen again, and we were sent to bed hungry. She tried to take Dad's plate once, but he shot her a dark look and used the smooth back end of his fork to shove her hand away before he picked up his plate to eat in the living room. Around this time, my bullies had taken to stealing my lunch at school, so I wasn't able to eat after recess, and because snacks were regulated, I barely took the edge off my hunger after school, and dinner was a battleground of mines and trenches. This gets important in a bit. I realized I had the same quality of mush on my tongue after 50 chews as I had at 150, and the mash was entirely unpleasant after 250, so I started shaving off so that it wouldn't feel like I was gnawing on vomit. My brother's OCD kicked in, and he began snitching, which got me sent to bed every day without dinner for a week, and a 7-minute whooping for breaking the plate, because I have barely gotten to 100 chews, and my brother saying that I was trying to get another, so I began to shovel because I was starving. This led to us staring each other down to snitch. The snitch only got hit in the head, and the one snitched on was sent away from the table. What was the prize for snitching? Not having to do the dishes if you snitched well. I think Dad knew something was up at school, because during this weeks-long snitching from my brother, Dad's habit of chips and salsa became my salvation. He always had it after dinner, and while I was curled up in bed trying not to think about food, he opened my door silently and put it on the corner of my dresser. I'd eat it in terror of being found out and eat it as quietly as a church mouse. I left it there for him to pick up after 10 minutes. Looking back, I'm so grateful now that I know why he always did that. Mom starved him too. Tired of having my lunches stolen, and no adult helping to prevent it at school, I devised a plan that exploited the boys in my grade, and I put my Tupperware on the table and told the kids that for pennies a food item, I'd eat whatever food they put in the Tupperware, and if I puked, I'd give them double the money. My parents are Texans, so even as a 4th grader I had a cast iron gut, and this did stop me from going home starving and won me no more than $1.50 a week as an allowance. When the teachers noticed my new gross habit, they had questions, and I told them I wasn't being allowed to eat dinner, and that bullies were stealing my lunch or pooping in my lunchbox. The bullies got disciplined by the school, and I learned about CPS. We went to family and individual counseling, and that was the end of the stabby, chewing, going to bed hungry phase of my life. The nail in the coffin for that was when we showed the caseworker our food stashes. I had mine hidden in the small space between my dresser drawers. Donald had his hidden in the space between his box spring and mattress. I had pilfered baggies of Goldfish crackers and Lay's potato chips and some rotten fruit. I had a Ziploc. Donald's was flaming hot Cheetos and coffee creamer. He kept the creamer in his dirty clothes hamper until laundry day. He was smart to have a drink. After this, she just shot snotty comments at us about food, our weight, and eating habits, but went back to the fair share rule until college. Mom complained to her couples therapist that she was the only one who did all the cooking and cleaning in the house, and she was tired. Just so the therapist suggested a division of labor that we all agreed upon, including the family cooking some meals a week, and especially my brother and I, as we'd need to know how to fend for ourselves after we moved out. On face value, this was fine, and I just made fodder because if I was eventually going to move out, I was not going to be able to afford things like New York strip steak or Thai curry paste from across town, and per the rule arrangement, cooked one dinner a week, same as my brother. I used to cook midweek, But during college classes, I ended up cooking early in the week, while Donald cooked on Saturday. Mom decided she wanted real recipes, and she forced me to plan for meals like chicken cordon bleu, French onion soup, and stuffed manicotti. Things no college student would make with ingredients no college student from a middle-class family with no scholarships and crippling student loans could afford to make regularly. She was also tired that the 2 good meals she got to eat without lifting a finger were weekends only, so she tried to force me to cook during the week when I had a lot of coursework to do. Force me. Not Donald, because golden child. I refused to cook before Thursday, so she still got her 2 meals back to back, but slightly earlier in the week. Again, she complained, and I refused to budge because I had coursework and Donald just sat in his room playing WoW. I can absolutely cook now, but the very act stresses me out because it's linked to memories of micromanagement from a backseat cook who gave me trauma and a deep-rooted flinch response. I hated being yelled at for not having the exact ingredients, being harassed to cook at a different time than I wanted to, and being criticized for having not cooked something right. Isn't my mom just a peach? Update. My entitled mom 37F would rather total her car than listen to me 16F. Sorry if this isn't quite the place for the story, but it's about where I could figure it went because my mom is heckin' entitled, and this time she decided her needs and wants were more important than the lives of others in the car with her. This happened in the early 2000s, so it's not recent, but after checking on a few of my old friends, I saw a news report that made me remember this tale of my entitled mother and the time she put hers, mine, and our dog's life in danger because she thought she knew how to handle a dangerous intersection because she could drive compared to her teenage daughter who medically wasn't able to drive. This happened in Southern California to give you an impression of the quality of drivers where I used to live. To set the scene, I will never drive, but that didn't mean I was unaware of the rules of the road and understand human nature when it comes to entitlement. It wasn't because I wanted to drive one day, but because I wanted to protect myself as a pedestrian from people in cars, trucks, and motorcycles. If I was going to be injured in an accident, I wanted to be right in the eyes of the law so that I had options if I survived an incident. This did in fact pay off once during high school by about $10,000. But I did not want to be rich that way. I can make a picture of this intersection, if necessary, but I hope I do it justice by description alone. Imagine, if you will, a main road, no smaller than 4 lanes wide at its thinnest, that runs between a lot of interstates, and you have to drive defensively to avoid an accident, as not all drivers are careful. This particular intersection had on its west end a hill that was so steep that you had to punch the gas to make it, if you had a large vehicle, and by the time you crested the hill to see the intersection you had to essentially be in the lane you wanted, because there was not much time before you got to the light, and you either follow through with your speed or slam the brakes. At this point, there were 5 lanes on our side and 4 on the opposite side of the street. One protected left hand where you could make a U-turn back down the hill, separated by a solid white line that was 6 cars deep, a left-hand turn lane, 2 straight lanes, and a protected right turning lane. This intersection in particular was in the news several times a month because of wrecks associated with drivers going up the hill and not being ready for whatever was at the top. The southwest corner boasted a high school across from a fast food joint, and between these 2 places was a tiny T intersection that would allow you to safely make it to the right-hand turn lanes without risking yourself to the drivers coming up the hill to make it to the other 3 lanes. But if you were stupid or stubborn like my mom, with a loose interpretation of the rules of the road, you could cut across all lanes of traffic, turn into the traffic that was going to be coming up the hill, and then turn into the protected U-turn lane, which made me fearful even during the day, because you really can't see who's at the top of the hill until you're up there. Perversely, Mom had more respect for that little white line than for the safety of herself and her passengers. On this day, I was doing some activities after school at the high school, and Mom came to pick me up in her silver Subaru Legacy with our terrier along for the ride. The sun had long since set, and there was no moon, and the stars were obstructed by the thick marine layer. I got in, and as we left the high school, I saw Mom looking at the dark downhill to see if there were any headlights coming up. I asked her to just go around the fast food place and to please come at the intersection from the south because it's safer. The south intersection was the direction the school buses took, so the turns did not have obstructed vision, and it was far better lit than what Mom was planning to do. I know what I'm doing. She sounded pissed that I questioned her judgment on the matter. I sat back, dog in my lap, looking out the windows as my all-knowing mom turned into the T intersection and started cutting across the traffic lanes to make the protected turning lane when suddenly, violent sideways motion. Seat belts did their safety lock. The dog slid into the passenger window and then down into the floor space with a solid thump, and all of a sudden I see the red lights turning green instead of the yawning darkness down the hill. Thankfully, the airbags hadn't deployed. Turns out a black sedan with dealership plates, and raced up the hill with no lights on, and was aiming for the unprotected turning lane, and had no time to stop, nailing Mom at the front of the driver's wheel well with their front corner, and both vehicles limped to the fast food parking lot to exchange information. This young lady, who barely looked old enough to drink, got out of her Nissan to meet the mega Karen that is my mom, and while I felt for the lady afterward at the moment, I was more concerned with the dog who weighed 14 pounds, and I wanted to see if she got hurt. She was fine. Later, when Mom filed a claim with her insurance, they declared the car totaled, and the other car didn't fare much better as both had warped frames. The Subaru was only 4 years old at most, great condition, regular maintenance, and now a wreck because Mom thought she had night vision or something, and didn't want to spend the extra time coming at a dangerous intersection from a safer angle. The worst that would have happened if she had listened to me was that we'd get home 5 minutes later than if she rolled the dice with everyone's lives because nothing had ever happened before. There were so many close calls at that intersection, even during the day, that I felt anxiety and nausea when she pulled this stunt, and all she ever did was to complain about the other drivers. Mom ended up getting a new silver Subaru that she was less happy with, kept making that scary turn to go back down the hill, and was less than impressed that Dad and I were not on her side about whose fault it was that the accident occurred. By the way, Dad took that intersection from the south when he had to get home down that hill because he liked his truck and knew better than to tempt local drivers to be safe about their turns and braking. Thank you for watching the video. If you are interested in listening to these kinds of stories, we've got more in store for you. Simply subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share it with your friends.